Chapter 281. Extending the trip. Glad to hear it, Metatron said before sending him flying out of a freshly opened exit in the cube with a wave of his tentacle, leaving only Gabe and Tlaloc behind. Oh, and I noticed you amassed quite a few credits last time you were here. Tell you what, if you can get to 5,000, I'll give you something you can't find elsewhere. The Titan added right as the door closed. Leo's body only came to a halt after tumbling over a dozen meters. Percy winced as he pulled himself up, rubbing his aching nose. This would have hurt a lot more if his host hadn't been at yellow. The bastard could have just asked him to leave instead of tossing him out like garbage. Hell, he could have simply teleported him out if he wanted. And I was hoping to catch up with Gabe too. I suppose I'll have to find him and Nolan later. Glancing around, Percy quickly noticed he was in the same area as the challenge cubes, though the place Metatron had just kicked him out of wasn't one of them. It was probably some kind of personal training room or something. Entering the nearest unoccupied cube, Percy leaned back on the wall, sliding down to the floor weakly. There were several things he needed to do, but he could use a few minutes to unwind. It's been one hell of a day, he smiled bitterly. His time on Felmara had been extremely fruitful, even before the Mana Flow class. Yet, his greatest gain in this entire trip was easily the final step of the boosting art. Granted, he'd only caught a glimpse of Tlaloc's demonstration before everything went to shit, and he knew he wouldn't be able to get a second look at it now that they were in the vault. Still, it had been enough for him to understand the underlying principles. It would take a while, but he should be able to replicate the spell with his pure affinity sooner or later. Adapting it to other mana types might be harder though. Part of him was tempted to leave right away, to bring everything back to his main body. But he still had a few matters to take care of. Now what? Leo suddenly asked, beating him to the punch. The boy had tried to put on a brave front, but Percy hadn't missed the fear leaking through their connection, and he didn't blame him for it either. In many ways, it had been an even messier day for the kid. He came back from the dead, only to be transported to a different world mere minutes later, leaving everything behind without even a chance to say goodbye to his friends. Alas, there wasn't much either of them could do about it. Luckily for you, the meeting went well. Metatron only cares about himself, but at least I'm useful to him, so I can strike a favorable deal every now and then. So, are we going to be stuck here for the rest of our lives? Sorry, kid. Percy sighed. Finding a way to bring you all out is one of my long-term goals, but I can't promise anything. I'll introduce you to the others later. They'll help you settle in. Next, he proceeded to explain how everything in the vault worked, giving Leo a taste of what his new life was going to be like. Naturally, the kid was revulsed upon hearing how the vault's gods mated with their own children, treating their own flesh and blood as livestock for their experiments. To his credit, he didn't complain though, knowing that none of this would have happened to him if he hadn't stood up against Raziel. Despite its flaws, life here will probably be an improvement for Tlaloc, at least. Percy concluded. Just don't do anything dumb and you'll be fine. He spoke that last part sternly, yet he wasn't exactly angry with his host. The truth was, he'd wanted to help Tlaloc since the moment he saw him dragged into the auditorium in chains. The only reason he'd hesitated was because he hadn't wanted to ruin Leo's life. If anything, the boy's selflessness had made his choice easier. Reading on Amazon or a pirate site. This novel is from Royal Road. Support the author by reading it there. Still, he'd meant it when he told him to behave. If Leo tried screaming in Metatron's face the next time he saw a kid starve to death, Percy wouldn't be able to protect him from the Titan's wrath. Only after getting a nod back did he shift his attention to other matters. Returning to the vault this early hadn't been his intention. He hadn't even finished digesting his gains from the previous trip. Yet here he was, and with a yellow host at that. Not to mention an affinity he was proficient in, and with the newfound freedom to use circulation in the challenges. Not pushing through the first few waves would be a colossal waste. Plus, there was that thing Metatron had mentioned. 5,000 credits was a lot to splurge at once, but Percy knew whatever the Titan gave him would be worth it. Of course, knowing how cunning the guy was, there had to be some ulterior motive behind the offer. Well, there's no harm in checking it out. I can always decline. After instructing Leo on how to clear his new channels and awaken his second core, he walked to the center of the room, starting the first wave of the Yellow Magiscript Challenge. Draw any 20 enchantments 3,000 times in total, in under 30,000 writs, with at least a 95% success rate. Each individual enchantment has to be drawn at least 100 times. At least 10 different enchantments have to contain multiple runes. Percy frowned upon reading the requirements. Once again, the first wave was somewhere between the third and fourth waves of the previous level in difficulty. 20 enchantments were the same as before, though he needed to pump them out faster. And it's specifically asking for composite enchantments this time. That's a first. I bet that's going to be the new standard moving forward. Overall, he wasn't too surprised. He'd always known he'd have to dig deeper into the field as he progressed through the levels. In fact, it was a good thing as it motivated him to keep improving, though he wasn't going to spend too much time or effort on Magiscript this trip. Let's see if I can get through the first one before Leo is done with the core. It shouldn't be too hard. As luck would have it, he'd coincidentally learned to draw 10 composite enchantments the last time he was here. Completing this wave was only a question of getting faster at it. Enchantments: preservation, concealment, hardness, absorption, control, memory, growth, heat, pressure, rotation, self-repair, controlled preservation, controlled concealment, controlled hardness, controlled absorption, controlled memory, controlled growth, controlled heat, controlled pressure, controlled rotation. Difficulty 1.6. Runes drawn 3,000. Time taken 29,766 writs. Success rate 61%. Score adjusted due to difficulty 97%. Congratulations! Wave 1 has been cleared. Calculating rewards. Awarded credits 300. Current balance 1829. About time, Percy exhaled. It had been 4 days since he arrived at the vault. Leo had already awakened the new core, a lightning affinity one, so Percy would have given up on the Magiscript Challenge after this attempt one way or the other. Checking the requirements of the next one for future reference, he grimaced upon realizing how tough it was. Draw any 30 runes 6,000 times in total in under 40,000 writs, with at least a 95% success rate. Each individual enchantment has to be drawn at least 100 times. At least 15 different enchantments have to contain multiple runes. Whatever. He rolled his eyes. Kid, are you ready to get our hands dirty? You done with rune crafting? Leo asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. I felt like my brain was about to melt. Percy clicked his tongue. I know it can be boring if you're just watching from the outside, but I would recommend that you pick up the art at some point. Not only is it the safest way to earn credits in the vault, but Magiscript is worth your time in and of itself. It was no secret he wasn't a huge fan of Metatron's personality, but there was no questioning the Titan's genius. I'll think about it. The boy replied non-committedly, and Percy didn't press him any further. As useful as it was, he knew Magiscript wasn't for everyone. The two then took a short break, eating some Sizian meat as they went over their plan for the combat challenges. Other than the passive boost to their physique, the second core wouldn't be too useful. It was a grade lower, and they'd barely opened enough channels to shoot a few bolts from their hands. For now, just focus on supporting me with an odd blast here and there. I'll do the rest. Cube. Start the first wave of the Gauntlet Challenge. Yellow level. User ID Wanderer. He said as soon as his host nodded. Authorization granted. Wave begins in 18 writs. Stretching his limbs, Percy began to take deep breaths one after the other, pumping mana into his channels. Wave begins in 12 writs. He blamed himself a little for never asking Galahad to show him the lightning pattern back when he was at the mansion. Not that they had the time to temper Leo's channels for it, but he could have saved the boy some head-scratching if he'd known it. I should try to learn all the patterns I can, given how often I change bodies, especially now that I can get more use out of my clones. Wave begins in 6 writs. Then he shrugged. Either way, this was a project for the future. Right now, it was time to smash some golems. Wave begins. May your challenge be successful. Chapter 282. Chapter 5000 credits. The yellow golem was nothing like the bouncing balls of the red level or the spider-like constructs of the orange level. It resembled a person, much like the green golems, yet it was far smaller than the hulking monstrosities Percy had fought alongside Gabe. Its lean frame was covered in yellow runes, its most threatening feature being the pair of long, curved blades replacing its forearms. Let's see what you're made of, then. Not waiting for the golem to move, Percy rushed forward at full speed. The tar covering the floor hindered his steps at first, but he didn't have much trouble jumping over it and running across its surface given how thick it was. The construct lunged, aiming to pierce his head, only to hit nothing but empty air. Percy circled around it with 3 swift steps, each of them aided by a perfectly timed burst of wind. Undeterred, the golem spun at its waist, sweeping its blades in a deadly arc. Anyone else in Leo's shoes might have ended up cleanly bisected by the sudden move. But it was Percy the construct was fighting, its speed a far cry from his own. Between circulation, the second core strengthening his physique, his fighting style honed after years of grueling practice, and the air affinity heightening his mobility, the golem had never stood a chance. Grabbing its upper arm with his left hand, he halted its telegraphed swing mid-motion, before clamping his right hand over its featureless face. Metal groaned as his fingers dug in, the viscous tar parting with a loud splash as he slammed the golem's head into the floor. Squirming, it struggled to free itself, but Percy never gave it the chance. Unleashing the compressed mana he'd prepared in his core, he felt his own bones ache from the shockwave as he blasted the golem at point-blank range. Alas, his opponent had it much worse, its head shattering into a dozen fragments, bringing the challenge to an abrupt end. Congratulations! Wave 1 has been cleared. Calculating rewards. Awarded credits, 300. Current balance, 2129. Wow! I didn't even need to use my new core, Leo noted. Don't worry, you'll get your chance sooner or later. The difficulty ramps up pretty quickly. Percy shrugged. Despite his words, he failed to stop the corner of his lips from curling up. Judging from how easy this wave had been, and how rewarding the yellow challenges were, getting to 5,000 credits would be a breeze. Can you use circulation by yourself? He suddenly asked. Leo shook his head. Not very surprising, given the boy's visceral reaction to the mana flow lectures. He'd clearly never put his mind to actually mastering the technique, his thoughts having been dominated by the ethical concerns surrounding the lessons. All right, pay close attention to the way the mana flows through your body as we progress. Speaking from experience, this is the fastest way to learn it. Congratulations! Wave 2 has been cleared. Calculating rewards. Awarded credits, 600. Current balance, 2729. Congratulations! Wave 3 has been cleared. Calculating rewards. Awarded credits, 900. Current balance, 3629. Once again, Percy stopped at the third wave, deciding to rest for a few hours before switching to the swarm challenge. As expected, his opponents had grown progressively tougher, each golem sporting an additional pair of arms, their agility climbing steadily along with the weapons they carried. The last one had even managed to nick Leo's shoulder, just a shallow scratch, but proof that the next round would be a struggle. In fact, they'd even needed to draw some extra juice from the boys' second core to put the construct down. Ensure your favorite authors get the support they deserve. Read this novel on Royal Road. I'm sure we can push through the fourth wave with some effort, but I'd rather just get this trip over with, he thought, switching to the other challenge. If he did equally well there, it should be more than enough to get him the credits he needed. Congratulations! Wave 1 has been cleared. Calculating rewards. Awarded credits, 300. Current balance, 3929. Congratulations! Wave 2 has been cleared. Calculating rewards. Awarded credits, 600. Current balance, 4529. Congratulations! Wave 3 has been cleared. Calculating rewards. Awarded credits. 900. Current balance. 54.29. It took Percy a few days to clear all the combat challenges, after which he was free to leave the challenge cube to meet up with the others. Fortunately, communication wasn't an issue for anyone in the group, despite the fact that everyone had come from a different background. Noland had it the worst, as he wasn't fluent in the Vault's language just yet. Still, he'd picked up enough to hold a conversation. Meanwhile, Tlaloc had already been given a translation device from Metatron, and Leo benefited from Percy's, though he'd have to start studying as soon as he was gone. At any rate, Gabe was ecstatic to have his body back in perfect condition for the first time in years. His second core had yet to catch up to his first one, but he could finally start focusing on his combat strength again. Now that his disabilities were gone and he no longer needed to worry about food, he could spend his credits on whatever he wanted. "Man, meeting you was the best thing to ever happen to me," he said, shaking Percy's hand vigorously. "Not only did you save my life, you gave me a second core, negotiated a pretty nifty deal for me, and even brought circulation to the vault. How can I ever repay you?" "Don't sweat it. I've benefited plenty from the vault too," Percy replied on the surface, though his thoughts told a different story. Sure, he didn't mind helping a friend in need for free, but he wouldn't have said no if the guy wanted to give him something in return. Sadly, the Vault's draconian rules made it impossible for people to just give each other stuff. Regardless, Percy had paid attention to everyone's progress with the boosting art. He still wasn't thrilled to have handed it to Metatron, but at least the Vault's residents would need a few years before they could use the spell. They'd have to train their bodies and temper their channels before they were even qualified to practice it. Unless the Titan decided to shower them with life mana to speed up the process, of course. Well, whatever. What's done is done. Let's just complete the transaction and get the hell out of here. Bidding his friends farewell, Percy found a relatively remote location before reaching out to the Titan using the cube's interface. Luckily, he didn't have to wait long for the Pentapus to appear before him. "I've got to say, I was impressed by your performance in the challenges this time. I suppose that's what happens when you stop holding back on me." The god chuckled. Ignoring the casual compliment, Percy noticed how carefully Metatron was observing him, and it didn't take a genius to guess why. Leo was currently running circulation, as Percy had instructed him to keep it active on his own until he left, to get used to the pattern under his supervision. Clearly, the Titan was more than happy to leech off the boy's efforts, accelerating his own research. "So, what have you got for me?" Percy asked, cutting to the chase. "A little impatient, are we?" Metatron replied with a question of his own, though he didn't leave him hanging. Lifting his tentacle, he allowed a drop of some black liquid to ooze out of his skin before gathering on the tip. It looked a bit like ink, but Percy could tell it was probably space mana, its color bearing striking similarities to Nesh's. That said, their grades couldn't have been further apart, the viscous droplet resembling all the other instances of divine mana he'd encountered in the past. At the same time, it appeared almost entirely colorless in his mana sense, as if his sixth sense was barely even capable of perceiving it. Oblivious to his thoughts, Metatron spun the droplet with a swift motion, the substance soon changing shape. It rapidly expanded into a rotating disc, countless grooves appearing on its surface, settling into interlocking symbols. "Are those runes? There must be hundreds of them." Perhaps Percy shouldn't have been so shocked to see one of the top runecrafting experts in the entire universe, the very mind that had invented the Vault's Magiscript, perform such a feat. Still, he couldn't help but compare his own skill to the Titan's. Leaving aside the sheer ease by which the god had drawn the runes, Percy knew he could have barely fit a couple of them in the same amount of space, let alone how seamlessly he'd combined them, visualizing all those compounding enchantments in his mind. "What does it do?" he asked, his mouth drying up. Whatever its function, there was no doubt it was worth way more than a measly 5,000 credits. After all, how often did a mortal get to commission a Titan to personally enchant something for them? Metatron remained silent for a few seconds, clearly doing so on purpose, to torment him a little longer. Only when Percy was about to ask again did the Titan decide to put him out of his misery. This is a storage seal. Chapter 283, Storage Seal. A storage seal? Percy already had several questions, but he placed them aside for a moment to do some calculations in his head. Assuming that one portion of Sizian meat was equivalent to 1 dose of elixir back on Remier, the spatial amulets that cost over 1 million contribution points each would be worth around 2,500 credits here. Metatron was charging him double that, though Percy didn't doubt the Titan's creation was several times better than the crude products of some mortal enchanters. Still, why would I even need something like this? He already had a bunch of spatial devices back home, and it wasn't like he needed one in the vault. He could keep his translation device in the system, and get all the books he purchased reprinted for free. Metatron chuckled, a hint of amusement finding its way into his gaze. If this was just a simple storage enchantment, I wouldn't have bothered to draw it personally for you. I'd have told you to buy one directly from the vault. This one is for the road. You mean, my clones can carry it in their travels? Percy's eyes widened. Exactly, and I'll have you know that getting this to work was tougher than you might think. The seal has to interact with your soul, otherwise it would simply phase through your clones. At the same time, the spatial dimension inside it needs to house physical objects. Trust me, you'd be very hard-pressed to find a second enchantment like it. The implications made Percy's heart skip a beat. He'd be able to accomplish so much more with something like this. Not only would he be able to equip his clones with armor and weapons, but he'd now have a way to bring stuff back from his trips. Noticing his excitement, Metatron pushed the seal along, causing it to float toward him, only for Percy to jump back in surprise. "Hold on a moment," he exclaimed, eyeing the Titan cautiously. "This sounds great and everything, but I can't just let you stick whatever you want in my soul. How do I know you're not up to something?" Metatron rolled his eyes at his outburst, some irritation seeping through. "Paranoid much? I've already attached my decree to you without you even noticing. Do you honestly think I need to rely on a cheap storage seal? Or that I'd bother lying to get your permission? Don't flatter yourself." Pondering the Titan's words, Percy had to admit he had a point. Then again, he wasn't exactly qualified to assess what was or wasn't possible when magic of such a high level was involved. "I can think of all sorts of reasons why you do it. Maybe your decree is immutable, so you need to rely on a more customizable enchantment to spy on me. Perhaps you need my consent because I can easily dig the seal out of my soul later. Or maybe you want to mind control me or something. Fully mind controlling someone is difficult even for a god with a mind affinity, let alone using your soul fragment as a proxy to take over your main body. Your fears are entirely misplaced. So you say, but you can't expect me to believe you're giving me something this valuable out of the goodness of your heart." Percy replied, "I never claimed I was. I'm doing it because I have as much to gain from this as you. Our latest deal has proven that." The god didn't elaborate, but it wasn't difficult to figure out what he meant. As powerful as the Morai's decree was, Metatron could have written it off as a fluke. Percy could only pass it to so many individuals, and the Titan hadn't had much reason to expect more from him. But circulation had changed everything. Not only could everyone in the vault learn it, but it was concrete evidence that Metatron's investment in Percy hadn't been misplaced. Clearly, the Titan wanted Percy's adventures to be as fruitful as possible, as he planned to eventually wrap his own tentacles around his gains. A case of literary theft. This tale is not rightfully on Amazon. If you see it, report the violation. If that's the case, then why charge me for it? Shouldn't you give me the seal for free? Percy asked, testing the waters. Not that he minded spending a few thousand credits on something worthwhile, but he had to confirm Metatron's intentions before agreeing to anything. Like I told you before, I'm not running a charity. Until you accept my original offer to work with me, our relationship shall remain purely transactional. Besides, if I charged you what the seal was actually worth, you'd never afford it even if you spent the rest of your life completing challenges. I'm only asking for the price of a regular storage device. Fair enough, but that still doesn't solve the trust issue. Well, what do you suggest I do? the Pentapus asked. How about this? Draw the enchantment again, this time very slowly. My skill in runecrafting is obviously far inferior to yours, so you'll have to explain what each individual rune does. In detail. That will take over 10,000 writs. Is this even about trust? Or are you trying to get a free Magiscript lesson from me? Percy shrugged. Naturally, his priority was still his own safety, but he'd be lying if he said he hadn't considered it. Think of it as payback for the air pattern you've stolen from Leo during this conversation. If you agree, I'll even describe the soul pattern for you. Do you think I can't discover the patterns on my own? Metatron asked. I'm sure you can, but I bet it'll take you more than a couple hours. Trust me, the soul pattern is a tricky one. The god remained silent for a few seconds, seemingly considering Percy's terms. Honestly, Percy knew he was getting the better end of the deal, but he also understood that, in the Titan's mind, everything Percy achieved would eventually belong to him. As fairly as the Titan appeared to treat him on the surface, Percy was under no delusion that Metatron thought of him as his equal. Much like everyone else in the vault, Percy was nothing more than an ongoing project. A door to more power. Well, the truth cuts both ways. Do you think the vault is the center of the universe? It's just another place filled with arrogant gods I'll surpass one day. Oblivious to his thoughts, Metatron soon came to a decision. Very well, but I suggest you pay close attention, as I'm only going to demonstrate the enchantment once. Crushing the previous seal into black motes, he pushed more mana out of his body, this time stretching it into a wider volume. Clearly, the god could easily compress the enchantment at will, but he intentionally made it easier for Percy to examine as he began forming the runes one by one, explaining their function. Recreating the enchantment took several hours. The number of runes involved vastly exceeding Percy's previous estimates. In fact, Leo was forced to deactivate circulation at some point, unable to keep going. Still, Percy didn't drop his focus for a second, unwilling to miss even a moment of Metatron's lesson. And it truly was an eye-opening experience, as he learned more during this demonstration than he would have after months of laborious study. A few of the runes he recognized. Very few. At the core, the enchantment involved pocket and stability runes, the bread and butter of all storage devices. The exact variants Metatron had chosen were different from the ones Percy had memorized and relayed to Nesha, but the underlying principles were the same. Though the Titan used way more of them, and even attached various amplification runes on them to vastly magnify their effects. Wow! These are some high-end enchantments. I wonder how large the internal space will be. Metatron hadn't said, but Percy knew the final product would make his own amulets look like trinkets. Whether it was the quality of the god's mana, or his sheer runecrafting skill, this was worlds apart from anything he'd seen before. Regardless, the seal contained a lot more secondary runes, giving it a lot of flexibility. To start, there was a reason Metatron had called it a seal and not an enchantment. Enchantments were meant to be applied on other objects, whereas seals were more advanced, as they could exist on their own. This was achieved through runes that gave the mana form and substance, without the need of a specialized material to draw the enchantment on. In some ways, it reminded Percy of his own crystallization spell, though the mana's permanence was achieved via runes in this case, rather than an innate property of the pure affinity. I've given the seal a fixed shape, but I've also enchanted it to only interact with your soul. You'll be able to move it around as you wish, to choose whether to grant it to a clone or keep it in your main body. Metatron explained. And this wasn't the only way in which the seal was flexible. Apparently, Percy could also divide it into smaller seals if he wanted. You can split it in half a maximum of 3 times, for a total of 8 seals. Keep in mind that it's inefficient though. Once divided, the overall capacity across all the different parts will be much smaller than that of the original. That said, you can stack them back together whenever you want to reverse the process. Percy nodded, knowing why the Titan had designed the seal like this. Right now, he could only have 2 cords active at a time, and one of them was permanently occupied by his familiar. But that wouldn't necessarily remain the case forever. Should he ever gain the ability to send out multiple clones, he'd be able to equip all of them with storage seals of their own. There you go then. All done. Metatron said, causing the completed seal to shrink back to its previous size. Chapter 284, Burnt Meat. Metatron pushed the seal into Leo's body, aiming at the section in his torso, housing the largest piece of Percy's soul. The mana ignored the boy's flesh entirely, entering Percy's wisp unobstructed. The latter tensed a little as the foreign object burrowed into him, but he didn't resist, having already scrutinized Metatron's enchantment to the best of his ability. There was some mild discomfort for a couple of seconds, but it soon faded into the background. Examining himself, Percy felt the seal floating inside his soul. Using some of his teal mana, he gave it a gentle nudge, realizing how easily he could move it around or even expel it. You can get rid of it whenever you want, but I would advise against that. I'm really not trying to cheat you here. I just don't want you leaving anything precious behind because you lack the means to carry it, Metatron said, guessing what he was thinking. Nodding, Percy then took a few minutes to explain how circulation worked for the soul affinity. Unfortunately, he couldn't demonstrate the spell without his core, so his verbal description would have to do. Metatron left after that, probably eager to return to his research. Percy didn't blame him for it either, actually sharing the sentiment. It was finally time to wrap things up. Cube, please reprint all the books I own for me. User ID Wanderer, he said, pressing his hand against the floor. Authorization granted. Delivery in 30 writs. Nodding in appreciation at the steaming stack of books that the system spat out a few seconds later, he then proceeded to purchase a few more resources that had piqued his interest the last time he was here. Between the rune index making it easier to browse through the catalog, and his new storage seal, getting what he wanted from the vault had never been easier. He wouldn't have to spend weeks memorizing what he needed either, as he could just take the books back to Remir and read them in his own time. The only annoying thing is that I'm down to 289 credits again. He grimaced, not particularly thrilled seeing his balance in the triple digits. Then again, he didn't regret any of his recent purchases. Leaving the seal aside, he was more than happy with the reading material too. It would keep him and Nesha busy for a few months at least. Plus, he still had more than enough credits left to buy several more books the next time he was here. Placing his hand on the stack, he then pushed some mana into the seal, causing the objects to instantly vanish from his sight. At the same time, he felt them appear inside the internal storage. Wow, it's actually huge. The pocket dimension was still shaped like a cube, much like his own amulets, but this one was 10 meters across. This meant it could house 1,000 times as much stuff as his existing devices. It should be plenty even after he split it up for his clones. Not to mention all the other convenient features, such as storing things by merely touching them, or accessing the seal's contents with just a thought. Metatron had clearly gone above and beyond to accommodate him. For a second, Percy considered browsing the system for some diatomine ingredients too, to solve his Aurora Dew problem. They shouldn't be very expensive, and he had the means to take them back now. But he quickly shot the idea down. He'd have to go through many options until he found a suitable replacement for the rainbow grass, and he wouldn't even be able to test them until he returned. Besides, credits were much harder to earn than money on Remir, making him think twice about wasting them on anything he could obtain a different way. Okay then, let's just help the kids settle in and I can go. Percy already felt bad for snatching Leo from his easygoing life on Felmara and dumping him inside what was essentially Metatron's prison. Granted, it wasn't his fault the boy's life had gone to shit, but he did feel obligated to at least make sure Leo was all right before leaving him here. Accompanying him to the same residential building as the others, he helped him pick an unoccupied room on Gabe's floor. Next, he requested a bunch of books on the vault's language. Luckily, those were free, unlike other, more sensitive resources. Do I really have to go through all of this? Leo gasped upon realizing how much work lay ahead of him. It'll take some effort, but I know you'll pull it off. I've read your notes on Felmara, so I can tell you used to be a good student. And if you need anything else, remember that Gabe lives 3 doors across the hall. Noland is on the next floor up. As for Tlaloc, I'm not sure, but he said he'd pick a room near theirs too. Percy reassured him before shifting his attention to something else. If you stumble upon this narrative on Amazon, be aware that it has been stolen from Royal Road. Please report it. Leo would be able to get all the food he needed for free thanks to his deal with Metatron, but they still had to find a way for him to actually ask for it without the translation device. Cube, is it possible to place a standing order for Sizian meat? He asked. This time, he had refrained from placing his palm on the floor or using his own ID. He wanted the system to recognize him as Leo to negotiate on the boy's behalf. Evaluating request. Evaluation complete. Placing a standing order is possible. 1 portion of Sizian meat is valued at 1 credit. Do you wish to place a standing order? I should be eligible for 2 free portions per day. Can you have them delivered here whenever they are due? Evaluating request. Evaluation complete. The standing order has been placed. After confirming that everything was in order, Percy was about to leave the vault when one last obstacle popped up in his path. Attention, user. 3 visitors are requesting access to your room. Do you wish to grant it? The system suddenly asked, causing him to raise an eyebrow. Can you show me who it is? He asked back, though he could already guess the answer. Sure enough, a few runes lit up on one of Leo's walls, before merging together into the image of their friends standing in the corridor. Though there was something strange about them this time. Their hands were behind their backs, clearly hiding something. Rolling his eyes, Percy allowed them in, curious to see what the trio was up to. Percy, are you still around? Tlaloc asked. Yeah. I was literally about to leave though. To what do we owe the visit? Anything wrong? The others smiled upon hearing that. Tlaloc might have smiled too, but it was difficult to tell, with him having a beak and everything. Gabe looked a little disoriented. He still wasn't used to having functioning eyes again. Meanwhile, Nolan stood there naked as always. Nothing wrong. We were just hoping to catch you before you left. To have a bit of a small celebration. To thank you for everything you've done for us. Gabe explained. Without missing a beat, all 3 of them showed him the stuff they were hiding. A couple chunks of yellowish-brown charcoal each. Thanks. Percy frowned as he took one of the objects from Tlaloc. What exactly is this? Nolan and Gabe chuckled upon hearing his question as Tlaloc scratched the back of his head in embarrassment. You can't tell either, can you? It's just charred Sizian meat, he said. Seriously? I didn't even know you could get it cooked a different way. You can't, Gabe replied. It's already edible in its default state after it gets cured by the system. But Tlaloc insisted that I charred them with my fire mana for the occasion. It looks like a complete waste of food to me, but he said he has a reason for it. Percy wanted to ask about that, though another question took precedence. How did the cube even let you give this to me? It wasn't that hard, Nolan said. We asked for permission, making it clear that all 4 of us are eligible for free food. The system refused at first, but I think Metatron intervened on our behalf because it just relented at some point. Will you try it already? Tlaloc asked, looking at him expectantly. Percy shrugged, biting a chunk off the overcooked snack. Truth be told, he'd never been a fan of its taste to start with. He really doubted that charring it to a crisp would make it any better, but he didn't want to be rude to his new pal. And, sure enough, cough. It's certainly memorable, he said, trying very hard to convince his host not to spit it out. The thing was positively dreadful, the meat's bitterness tuned up to 11. Biting through its hard exterior was a chore, its texture dry as a desert. Hell, Percy wasn't even sure the burnt meat had any nutritional value left, nor did he think it could still function as a cultivation resource. It's garbage, isn't it? Gabe asked, Nolan nodding along. Clearly, they'd both had a taste already. Flashing Tlaloc a questioning look, Percy was genuinely curious whether the guy was trying to poison him, or if he really had 0 sense of taste. Considering that he'd spent his whole life in chains, it wasn't impossible. I'm really sorry about the flavor. Tlaloc snickered, proving he was fully aware of what he was doing. I don't get it. Was this a prank or something? Percy asked. Not exactly. Tlaloc sighed, his expression getting more serious, My older brother used to char meat for me back when I was little, before I got captured and shipped off to Felmara. Over the next few minutes, he spoke about his past. Apparently, it was common practice on Huehue, as doing this was a quick way to rid the meat of some of its potential diseases. Obviously, it wasn't as good as taking the time to properly cook the meat uniformly, but many families on the run didn't have the luxury of stopping at one place for long. Getting sick could be a death sentence for young, low-born children, so their parents had to try everything to better their odds. Obviously, I didn't personally need this after my core awakened at Green, but my brother kept the tradition going. He said it reminded him of our parents. I know it tastes like shit, but believe it or not, some of my fondest memories are from eating this by his side. Percy didn't miss the tears glistening by the corner of Tlaloc's eyes. Not wanting to insult the poor guy, he begrudgingly moved the burnt meat to his mouth again, biting a second chunk. This time, Leo didn't utter a word of protest, and the others also joined in, the former slave story having probably touched them just as much, but Tlaloc wasn't done. Anyway, I didn't bring this up just to reminisce about my past, or to ruin the mood, he chuckled. I just thought about that amnesiac friend of yours you were trying to help. I don't know anything about his life before the Colosseum, but it's possible his family used to feed him the same thing when he was little. This Scythian meat tastes a little different from the animals on Huehue, and I've no idea what the meat in your homeworld tastes like. But it might still jog a memory or two if you cooked something like this for him. Thanks, man. I'll introduce you to one day, after he remembers, Percy said, some warmth gathering in his chest. The group then finished their meals in silence. Only once they were all done did Percy store the translation device in his seal, removing his soul from Leo's nearly healed injuries. Allowing the cord to pull him out of the vault, he finally set course for Remir. Chapter 285. Welcoming the Holy Child. I've been clearing new channels all week, but I still can't figure out how this thing works. Acton clicked his tongue in frustration. Mickey barely spared him a glance as he landed beside him in a flurry of feathers and residual mana. He had long learned to keep his expressions neutral, his emotions locked behind the pretense of obedience. There was no point in antagonizing his captor. It would only make his life harder. Originally, he'd wanted to keep circulation hidden, unwilling to offer Acton even a sliver of insight into the technique. Doing so would only make him stronger than he already was, harder for the others to rescue him. Sadly, the boy had already witnessed the spell during their chase, leaving Mickey no choice but to demonstrate it upon receiving the command. It's fine. He won't be able to copy it. He doesn't even know he's supposed to strengthen his body first. Mickey reminded himself. Besides, Percy is right. I need it. Percy had advised him to keep both regulation and circulation running at all times regardless. They were essential to minimizing his stamina drain and to furthering his training. Not only that, but he'd instructed him to continue working on his water and ice affinities, to complete the spell as soon as possible. They weren't just thinking about the present. Cut off from Aurora Dew, Mickey's growth was already stalling. Even worse, Acton hadn't given him any regular elixirs either, having not yet realized that his second core required them, just like everyone else's. If his first core reached green before his second got to yellow, finding enough food would grow even harder. At that point, the only way to quell his hunger would be through his spells, meaning he couldn't afford to slack off. Glancing at his wings, he felt a wave of relief as he marveled at the two sets of glowing lines decorating his plumage. The green ones swirled like gales of wind, as the newest addition, the aquamarine lines, resembled waves. Well, at least I've got the water pattern down. Only one to go. It was barely any consolation given his current predicament, but he'd take what he could. With this, the mana flowing to and from his abdomen was balanced at last, meaning he wouldn't have to waste the excess. Of course, converting the water mana to beast mana wasn't as efficient without a mutation, but that would hopefully get fixed in time. As for the amber lines, they weren't there at the moment. Luckily, Acton's commands to use that weird spell and to get a move on hadn't been too explicit, leaving them open to interpretation. This was how Mickey had managed to hold on to his beast mana, though he'd still been forced to fly back to Goldenfield Town faster than he'd have liked. "Hey, don't look so sad." Acton grinned, some amusement seeping into his tone. "I told you I'd get you something to eat, didn't I? There are hundreds of people living here, plenty of them at yellow or green. You can have as many as you like." Mickey felt the blood freezing in his veins at the sheer nonchalance in the boy's voice as he casually talked about feeding him his own kin. This was precisely what they'd feared. Clearly, Acton didn't give a shit about the commoners. He'd gladly sacrifice hordes of them just to make his own life a little easier. Recoiling in disgust, Mickey tried to resist the command to stop walking. He pushed against the illusory chains with everything he had, using every drop of willpower in his body. But it was futile, his talons digging into the dirt no slower than before as he strove forward. Unauthorized use. This story is on Amazon without permission from the author. Report any sightings. "No. Please, don't make me do this." The scream died in his throat. Sure, he'd eaten humans before, but only their enemies, the people who'd tried to kill him or Percy. The thought of massacring a bunch of innocents just to satiate his hunger made him sick. It was wrong, repugnant. He was tempted to beg, but he doubted Acton would listen. It would only reveal his ability to speak, making everything worse. Oblivious to his thoughts, the growing crowd parted before them, startled gasps and awed exclamations echoing near the gate. He didn't know whether the townsfolk were more shocked by the arrival of the Holy Child, or by his own, a yellow beast with two cores following obediently behind a human. Either way, it didn't matter. A few stepped back in unease, but most of them were completely unaware of the danger they were in. In fact, many had the opposite reaction. "A holy child!" a woman shouted gleefully. "It's our town's fortune to receive you," another added. Many more cheered, some of them even bowing in respect. The fools were happy to see the little monster. As for the demon in question, he failed to suppress a smirk at the irony of the situation. "Run, you idiots! Grab your kids and get the hell out of here. I won't be able to stop myself once he gives the command." Mickey's heart raced like crazy, a frantic drumbeat pounding against his ribs. He clenched his beak as tightly as he could, ignoring the piercing pain as cracks rippled through it. "Percy, help me. I don't know how, but you can't let me do this." It didn't take long for Percy's voice to ring in his mind, accompanied by a wave of horror and a packet of soul mana. "Help me strengthen the connection. We'll fight this together." Without wasting a moment, Mickey bounced the mana right back, working with his friend to widen the cord. He wasn't sure this would be enough to stop him. They'd already tried and failed to resist the boy's bloodline before, but Percy's words still brought hope to Mickey's eyes. There was nobody else on Remir he trusted more. Just having him by his side meant the world. "Go on then. Eat," Acton muttered, his voice barely a whisper. But Mickey heard it clearly, every word slamming into his skull with undeniable authority. Some of the commoners must have heard him too, as the smiles froze on their faces, their features twisting in terror. Sadly for them, however, Acton never gave them a chance to escape. Stone walls rose from the ground, trapping dozens of people with Mickey. Among them were men and women of all ages, ranging from reds to yellows, from toddlers to an elderly lady. There was a green in the group too, though he didn't look like much of a fighter. Instead of attacking Acton, his first instinct was to turn around and try to break through the prison. Unfortunately, his pitiful water spells splashed harmlessly against the construct. As for the others, they didn't even try to resist. Regardless, Acton unleashed his domain for good measure, sealing the deal. Everyone who had somehow managed to remain standing instantly fell to their knees, whatever strength they had left evaporating from their muscles. At the same time, the ground shook as a second round of constructs clawed their way up, not taking long to pierce the surface. It was a series of giant hands made of stone, one for each person. The colossal limbs grabbed their immobilized victims, each of them large enough to close comfortably around an adult's body. The joyous cheers that had previously filled the place were instantly replaced by panic screams and pained shrieks, everyone finally realizing this wasn't a day of celebration. As for Mickey, He'd never stopped bouncing mana to his friend for even a second, as his body continued to move on its own. Walking up to the nearest prisoner, he barely halted for a moment as his tall frame loomed over her, casting an ominous shadow over her limp frame. She was a woman whose appearance placed her in her 20s, a yellow core pulsing in her chest. His shadow wasn't nearly dark enough to hide the agony in her expression or the fear in her eyes. Her features were covered in snot and tears as she silently pled for mercy. But no sound escaped her lips, the giant fist clenched around her chest having squeezed the breath out of her lungs. "Come on already. We haven't got all day," Acton spat. The boy's voice was cold, devoid of empathy, as if he had ordered him to munch on a worm rather than a person. Yet his words resonated with his bloodline once more, amplifying the pressure in Mickey's mind. His beak opened against his will, his muscles tensing. He had no control over any of this, but he could tell he was about to rip the core right of the woman's sternum the very next second. "Percy, it's now or never." Chapter 286, Graveyard. The stone fingers loosened slightly, exposing the woman's sternum. Unable to resist, Mickey pounced toward the opening. He was about to rip the core from her chest when another hand, a much smaller one, suddenly emerged from his own body, grabbing his beak. It was cold, made entirely of mana, not unlike Acton's spells. His grip wasn't very strong, but it didn't need to be. His own hesitation did the rest, allowing the hand to slam his beak shut. "What the hell?" the holy child blurted out in shock. The boy's surprise was justified. By all rights, Mickey shouldn't have been able to fight his command. Even more baffling was the nature of the construct. It had sprouted from his own body, yet not from his cores. In Acton's mana sense, it had seemingly appeared out of thin air, fueled by some strange affinity that Mickey didn't even possess. And that was only the beginning. More mana surged through his channels. This time his own. Pale blobs seeped from his pores, blooming like frozen flowers along his joints. They quickly solidified into blocks of ice, inhibiting his movements. "How dare you defy me? You are nothing more than my servant. Stop whatever you're doing," Acton snarled. But the mana continued to rush through his body uninterrupted, forming a thin shell of ice over his plumage. At first, it almost emptied his second core, but the constant circulation of water and air mana flooded the organ, mixing together to replenish his reserves. At the same time, more fused mana gushed through the cord, a second teal arm sprouting from his chest, mirroring its sibling. It clamped down on his beak too, struggling to buy a few precious seconds for the ice mana to do its job. Even better, Mickey was given a moment of reprieve. Acton's poorly worded command had allowed him to briefly stop fighting his own body. After all, the only thing he had done was to follow the boy's orders. Everything else was all Percy. "Just kill that woman already, or I'll kill you both myself," the boy yelled, probably realizing his gaffe. This time, Mickey was forced to comply, his muscles ripping themselves apart as he fought against his binds. The ice around him cracked and crumbled in several spots, the magical fingers holding his beak snapping one by one. Noticing his pain, Percy hesitated, the mana easing slightly. "Don't stop," Mickey hurriedly said. "Don't worry about me. I can handle it. Besides, I doubt he'd let me die." Percy nodded, doubling down on his resistance. Sending more of his mana, he forcefully seized Mickey's cores too, reforging the hands and the ice shell once more. Of course, Percy was fighting an uphill battle, despite his initial success. Stopping a yellow beast with some orange constructs wasn't easy, let alone doing so from afar, with mana that didn't even entirely belong to him. Thinking outside the box, he grabbed hold of Mickey's beast mana too, slowing down the passive flow in his veins to weaken him. But the pressure in Mickey's mind only increased as his muscles drank his beast mana against his wishes. The opposing flows collided violently inside his body, ripping holes into his vessels. Blood spilled out of his orifices, as he felt like his flesh was on fire. Sadly, he won out in the end, managing to extricate himself from the binds half a minute later. The immobilized woman trembled as he stepped on her shoulder with his talon, crimson rivulets dripping from his cracked beak, splashing ominously on her neck. "No! Please, don't hurt my mom," a boy cried. Mickey couldn't even turn his head to look at him. Judging from his voice, he had to be young. Younger than Acton. Probably younger than he had been back when his own mother was murdered in front of him. This content has been misappropriated from Royal Road. Report any instances of this story if found elsewhere. Suddenly, the frozen wasteland flashed before his eyes once more. The dim glow of Huehue's red sun blending with the bloody pool beneath the two corpses. "Percy, kill me if you have to." His friend paused again, clearly unwilling to go through with it. But there was no time to think it over. "Don't let me do this to him. I don't want to be a monster," Mickey pleaded again, bloody tears rolling down his face. Percy acquiesced, sending more foreign mana into his body. Unlike before, it spread through Mickey's frame, slicing countless tiny incisions into his soul. It hurt 100 times more than the physical wounds, causing him to almost fall unconscious as his vision blurred and his brain throbbed. Yet, a wave of relief rushed over him. It worked. He lost control of his body at last, falling powerless on the ground next to the woman. "Thank you," he sent back, though he didn't get a reply. Percy was already doing his best to stitch the wounds up before his soul deteriorated any further. Healing him was probably harder through the cord, but he'd been careful when injuring him. Oblivious to his thoughts, the woman next to him shifted. Her head was close to his, her lips moving as she tried to whisper something. He couldn't make out her words, but her gaze was filled with more than just fear this time. There was gratitude and pity. Mickey was about to respond when a spear jutted upwards. The sound of ripped flesh echoed through the stone cage, a bucket full of blood splashing onto his face. This time it wasn't his own. The woman's pupils shook for a second, before glazing over. An oppressive silence followed, but it only lasted a few seconds until the boy's wails pierced it. A hand painfully grabbed the back of Mickey's head, pushing his face into the woman's body. "I said eat," Acton growled as the scent of iron filled Mickey's nostrils. But he didn't open his beak. Not because he could resist the boy's command, but because Percy had deliberately avoided repairing that part of his soul. "Ha ha 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 ha!" The boy laughed sardonically, struggling to conceal the rage in his voice. "You think you can do as you please, huh? Very well. It's time for you to learn what happens when you defy your master." Pulling his face out of the woman's corpse, Acton forcefully turned him around, to look at the other people pressed on the ground under his constructs. Closest to him was the newly orphaned boy, struggling to breathe between sobs. He couldn't have been older than 5 or 6, his curly hair caked in mud, his cheap clothes full of holes. With a flick of Acton's fingers, a second spear emerged. Mickey wanted to look away, but the holy child didn't let him move an inch. "This is what happens when you don't do as I say," Acton hissed. He turned Mickey's head again, to look at a burly guy farther away. He was bald, an eye patch covering his left eye. Mickey recognized him as the Green from earlier. Unlike the others, Acton must have attacked him at some point, when he wasn't looking. He was covered in wounds from head to toe, 2 stone hands having joined forces to hold him still. "I have no idea why you even care about these people, but you're gravely mistaken if you think you've done them a favor." Acton spoke again, sending a third spear, this time through the man's skull. Next, he turned his head again to face another woman. Petite brunette who looked like she was pregnant. "You could have just eaten a bunch of them to quell your hunger." 2 spears rose this time for good measure. "Now, I'll make sure to kill more of them, just for you." Another spear, and then 2 more. It wasn't until a couple of minutes later that everyone inside the cage was dead, the stone walls already crumbling. There was nobody outside, the others having long run away. But Acton wasn't done, apparently. More spears emerged, this time beside him. With a flick of his hand, he sent them flying to the nearest house, piercing through the walls as if they were paper. And that was merely the start. The Holy Child repeated his actions again, and again, shooting barrage after barrage through the buildings. Mickey didn't think the boy even bothered to check whether there was anyone inside. Not before his attacks, and certainly not after. Dragging Mickey's limp body across the town, Acton ravaged everything in his path. Occasionally, muffled screams echoed through the holes. A few times, people rushed out on their own before he attacked, groveling before him, begging for him to spare them. He never did. The Holy Child stopped at some point. Not because he'd suddenly grown a conscience, nor because he'd killed everyone in the town. He'd barely decimated a little over half. As far as Mickey could tell, the boy had simply grown bored of the carnage. His heart felt heavy, as if it had turned to stone. Neither his physical wounds, nor the injuries to his soul bothered him anymore. His gaze dull and lifeless. Just like that, dozens of innocent people had lost their lives. And all of this over nothing, he thought bitterly. The cheerful crowd that had welcomed the Holy Child with open arms had paid dearly for their respect. Their town now a bloody graveyard. Chapter 287, Gaze. You still won't eat? Acton hissed, his voice laced with frustration. With a single vicious kick, he sent both the bird and the man's corpse tumbling through a shattered wall like discarded dolls. The veins on his forehead throbbed, the blood inside his veins boiling at the beast's defiance. Not necessarily because he cared that much about it refusing to eat a few peasants. Even having to take a detour for a couple of days to hunt a different meal for it wasn't that big a deal. The real issue lay elsewhere. This was supposed to be different. You were supposed to be different. My ticket to greatness. He stormed towards the creature once more, his features twisting in fury. Lifting his foot, he drove it down on the bird's knee just hard enough to send a jolt of pain through its body. Though he did stop short of shattering the limb entirely. Despite his words, he wasn't ready to give up on his minion quite yet. Defiant or not, the beast had continued to prove its worth at every turn. It was far stronger than a regular yellow, probably strong enough to hold its own against a green. Should it advance, it was bound to become a powerful helper, elevating his fighting strength to the next level. With that, he would finally be able to stand tall among his peers. But that only works if my bloodline keeps you under control, he snarled, slamming his boot into the bird's chest. A sharp crack met his ears as a rib gave way under his foot, the creature wincing in agony. Acton wanted to vent some more, to pummel the beast to his will. But he forced himself to stop before he did any lasting damage. This much should be okay. Beasts had sturdy bodies and healed fast. He'd been careful to leave its organs and wings mostly intact. I'll have to carry it to its next meal though, he sighed. After waiting a couple minutes for the dust cloud to settle, he walked to the largest piece of stone he could find amidst the rubble. Pouring some mana, he flattened it, smoothing the rough edges enough to sit on it. His gaze fell on his minion's bloodied body, its chest heaving up and down weakly. At the same time, he thought back to its previous actions, contemplating the implications. This didn't bode well at all. It was way too early for it to be showing signs of resistance. Would the bloodline even hold once it advanced? No, there's nothing wrong with my bloodline. It worked like it was supposed to. He corrected himself. Technically, the bird had followed all his commands without fail. Acton couldn't pinpoint any specific action that violated them. At least, none that the bird had taken of its own volition. The problem clearly lay elsewhere. It had all started when that strange teal mana popped out of thin air, holding the creature back. It had manifested human arms too. Not a beast's doing. This confirmed that somebody else was involved. Even more unsettling was the sheer range of abilities they possessed. In a direct contest, Acton's bloodline had won out. Otherwise, he wouldn't have managed to enslave the bird in the first place. However, he had failed to completely override its connection to its previous owner. Worse still, they could control it from afar and even send their mana to it somehow. He shook his head. That's merely the tip of the iceberg. They can hijack its own mana too. And they've somehow brainwashed it more thoroughly. It was more willing to side with them just now. One thing was certain. This wasn't one of his relatives. Couldn't be. Acton knew all his elders, and all of them had the same crappy version of the bloodline as him. It was possible that one of the younger children had suddenly manifested a new strain in the past couple of years, but he struggled to believe that. Did you know this story is from Royal Road? Read the official version for free and support the author. The gods had us breed for thousands of years with nothing to show for it. What are the odds somebody just managed to mutate such a powerful variant right after I left? He frowned. This had to be somebody else entirely. Yet that was even more disturbing in some ways. It meant that another house had secretly developed the most powerful beast-controlling bloodline on the face of Remier. Well, whatever. I bet they aren't a Greenborn. If they dare get in my way, I'll get rid of them. Regardless, it appeared this person had a soft spot for commoners. As long as he avoided doing anything this drastic, they might not get involved again. Anyway, where are those idiots? Did they somehow miss the commotion? Acton raised an eyebrow. There had been other towns closer to him. The only reason he'd bothered to bring the bird here was because he'd also wanted to rejoin his guards. He wasn't that surprised those weaklings had lost his trail during the chase, but they should have returned here and patiently waited for him. Maybe they're out there looking for me? It's also possible they returned to the route to report my absence. Whatever the case, he wasn't going to wait here for them. If he didn't see them by the time he reached the Thirsty Valley, he'd just request a new escort from the people there. Getting up, he glanced at his minion once more. Since you insist on not eating human meat, I'll make an exception for you, just this once. The ground shook as he poured a colossal amount of mana into the dirt. Soon, a giant hand of stone rose from underneath the bird, its huge fingers closing around it. Lifting the creature to the air, the disembodied forearm then traveled towards Acton, cracking the ground in its path. Upon reaching him, it lowered the creature just enough for its eyes to level with his. I'll feed you beasts, but this is the only compromise I'll make for you. Consider it a gift from your new master. Yet know this, if you defy me one more time, I'll squash you like a bug. I've no need for a disobedient slave. The bird didn't react. Acton wasn't sure it had even heard him, its silver eyes dull and lifeless. He was about to turn around, when he suddenly felt a cold shiver roll down his spine. Startled, he took a step back. The hell? He spat, trying to make sense of this. For a second there, he'd felt someone's gaze run through him like a sword. But there was nobody around. His mana sense confirmed that. Nobody besides the bird, and it was barely awake. Looking into its listless eyes once more, he sensed it again. A torrent of unconcealed fury, seeking to split his very soul apart under its cold edge. Then he blinked, and it was gone, almost as if he'd imagined the whole thing. Acton couldn't help but swallow a lump. Logically, he understood he had nothing to fear. He was a Greenborn, a blue. Very few people on Remier could best him in a fight, and fewer still would dare to even try. Yet, the owner of that glare just now didn't seem to care in the slightest. Not about his strength, nor about his status. His primal rage branding him with a silent promise. Was this person even human? The past couple of weeks had been quite intense, to say the least. Ever since they got separated from Mickey, the trio had traveled toward the Thirsty Valley at full speed, only taking a break whenever it was absolutely necessary. And their labor had paid off as they were nearly there, about to reach their destination in a few days. Suffice to say, everyone was optimistic that they'd make it there in time. They'd have to solve a bunch of other issues before they could enter, of course, but it seemed they stood a real chance of rescuing Mickey. Not everything was going well. However, how long has it been? Nesha whispered. An hour or two? Elaine replied, her forehead creased. The two kept their voices down, to avoid distracting Percy. Usually, he was the first to urge them all to rush, ignoring his own fatigue to save even a minute whenever possible. Yet, he'd halted his steps of his own accord earlier today for some reason. Since then, he'd stood in the same spot, staring ahead without blinking. It didn't take a genius to guess that something had happened to Mickey, and, from the looks of it, it was bad. At some point, Percy had also activated synchronization. huge volumes of mana disappearing from his body at regular intervals. Needless to say, Nesha and Elaine were dying to ask him what was wrong, but they didn't dare to utter a word. "I've never seen him like this." Elaine struggled to contain her worry as she glanced at the ground beside Percy's feet. Nesha followed her gaze to the 2 crimson puddles there. The blood had halfway seeped into the dirt, but more splashing droplets occasionally expanded its surface, dripping from his clenched fists. "Me neither," Nesha replied, thinking back to all the enemies they'd faced since they escaped from the guild. The wasps, the bandits, House Tantalus, the beasts, the trolls, even the divine root. Percy had fought each of them with everything he had, but he'd always managed to remain calm through it all. This was different. His eyes glowed with cold fury, his seemingly vacant gaze actually piercing the void with murderous focus as it crossed the vast distance separating him from his familiar. Nesha and Elaine would have to wait for this to end before asking for the details. But one thing was already clear. Whatever that boy did to Mickey, he's going to regret it. Chapter 288. Promise. Every step sent a jolt of pain up his legs, his shoes already soaking in blood. Over the past couple of weeks, Percy's group had averaged over 20 hours a day on the road. Not to mention, he had it the worst among the 3 due to his grade. His only relief was the gentle breeze softly caressing his tired features, mercifully brushing away the acrid scent of sweat surrounding him, though more seeped through his forehead, his eyebrows failing to prevent it from trickling into his eyes. Still, he refused to stop, knowing that the battle against the Holy Child had already begun. Sure, they were currently separated by a vast, albeit constantly shrinking, distance, but the race to their next promotion was no less important than their eventual clash would be. And Percy had more on his plate other than merely reaching the Thirsty Valley. After all, he wouldn't be able to advance fast enough without Aurora Dew, and his enormous stash of elixirs wouldn't convert itself. Certainly not before he procured the right ingredients or completed his preparations to accelerate the process. Thus, he'd had no choice but to improvise, to find ways of spending his time on the road even more productively. The bag is full again. Reaching at his waist, he unstrapped the cloth bag he'd hastily fashioned a few days ago, giving it a quick shake. The teal marbles made crisp sounds as they rolled and collided with one another. Grabbing one of the amulets around his neck, he poured some mana into it, causing the cube to expand. Holding it clumsily with one hand, he struggled not to drop it as it grew to the size of a crate. Next, he pressed his chin on a rune, using some more mana to open the box. Emptying his bag into the container, he willed the marbles to shatter into powder. Then he shrunk the amulet, hanging it back around his neck, and the bag to his waist, right below the modified effigy. The spell hadn't changed much. He'd only made the links between the crystals and the beak even thinner, so that they wouldn't hold under the weight of a fully grown marble. This way, the crystals would break off on their own whenever they reached their full size, rolling into the bag. It wasn't the most groundbreaking idea, but it allowed Percy to passively accumulate teal dust as he walked, by simply pouring mana into the construct, leaving his hands free to do other things. Well then, I have another hour until it's full again. Next, he grabbed another object from his pocket. A rectangular slab of reinforced mana, as big as his palm. It glowed in an eerie teal light, much like everything else he crafted. Strictly speaking, it wasn't very different from the effigy, sporting a single self-repair enchantment on its back, its front face smooth as glass. Perhaps this was why his status hadn't seen fit to register it as a separate spell. Yet, its function was entirely different. Lifting his free hand, Percy gathered some more mana to his fingertips before carefully carving a few lines into the object. Keeping his fingers steady was a struggle, neither his exhaustion nor the bumpy ground doing him any favors. But he was already experienced in runecrafting by now, seeing this as just another challenge to overcome. At first, he drew 3 concentric circles, before filling them with more details. Soon, the outermost ring resembled a heat rune, the innermost 2 containing overlapping control runes, linked in a very special manner. One of them was constrained to the inner circle, while its sibling was free to span both regions. Suffice to say, this was one of the cascading control enchantments he'd studied in the vault. All the craziness since Gentle Breeze Town had prevented him from working on this before now, but he was keenly aware he'd have to upgrade his cauldron soon. If everything went according to plan, he could significantly boost his brewing speed, which might just be the difference between rescuing his familiar or losing him forever. Thus, he continued to push himself to his limits and beyond. His body ached and protested as he forced it to keep moving, his cores burning under the relentless rush of mana. Even his mind wasn't spared as he focused on his runecrafting. A case of content theft. This narrative is not rightfully on Amazon. If you spot it, report the violation. Another failure. He grimaced about 40 minutes later, once the enchantment failed to activate. He knew there was nothing wrong with its design. Not only had he copied one of the illustrations from the book, he'd spent way longer than necessary to ensure the intricate symbol was flawless. The problem lay with his visualization of the composite enchantment. He sighed, pouring some mana into the self-repair rune. At least that one worked, flashing brightly before slowly erasing its malfunctioning sibling from the other side of the slab. This was the object's true purpose, a convenient training tool that allowed him to practice his runecrafting on the move. The bag will be full again in a few minutes, he frowned. He didn't have enough time to start another attempt, so he should probably wait to empty the bag first. Turning to his companions, he noticed they weren't slacking either. Nesha didn't look quite as exhausted as he was, but mana continuously surged through her channels as she slowly forced them to expand. She hadn't started working on her circulation pattern just yet, but her pathways were almost fully tempered by now. Of course, she hadn't had much time to exercise while traveling. None of them had, but they didn't need to. The only reason one had to strengthen their body before practicing circulation was because it allowed them to push their channels further, letting them contain more mana. Once they got to the tempering stage, pushing mana through the channels grew physically demanding in and of itself, allowing them to easily maintain their physical condition. I should talk to her at some point. She hadn't spoken a word about it, but he knew that losing Mickey had weighed heavily on her, more so than him or Elaine in some ways. Granted, she hadn't known the Crow for nearly as long as them, but she also felt guilty over her inability to help them against the Roots men. Percy wanted to console her. It wasn't really her fault she couldn't fight against a bunch of greens at yellow. She was already doing plenty, but he ultimately chose not to disturb her right now. Letting her channel her frustration productively would benefit her in the long run. Elaine also seems to have been affected by the fight. His cousin was the only one who hadn't broken a sweat, but that didn't mean she was taking it easy. Her forehead was creased, mana constantly rushing to her feet, enveloping them in a thin film of water. Clearly, she wasn't satisfied having only elevated one of her newest spells to refined. He'd seen her work on her magic before, but never this relentlessly. Something during her fight against the three greens must have shifted her mentality. And there was another bit of good news, despite all the recent chaos. His latest clone had been gone for a while, which was always a great sign. Doubly so, given his efforts to return to Huehue. It didn't necessarily mean he'd succeeded, but he must have found something of value regardless. And Phoebe knew Percy needed every advantage he could get right about now. Just hurry up and return already, wherever you are. Though he shook his head the very next moment, forcing himself to calm down. There was no sense in getting impatient. He still had plenty of things to do, so he should just stick with his current plans for now. If the clone brought anything useful back, he could adjust course accordingly. Seeing that he had a couple more minutes to kill until his effigy was done, he turned his attention to the cord. "Mickey, how are you holding up?" The response came delayed. "I'm not. He's holding me up with that spell of his." Mickey joked, trying to put a brave front. But Percy didn't miss the deep pain and despair simmering beneath his friend's words. "I don't suppose you've been able to keep your spells up?" Percy asked again, though it wasn't difficult to guess the answer. "Not circulation. My body hurts too much when I try, but I can still feed some of my elemental mana to my beast core." Percy nodded. As serious as Mickey's injuries were, They weren't life-threatening anymore. Despite his senseless cruelty, Acton had still been careful not to inflict any lethal wounds. As for the soul injuries, Percy had done his best to stitch them up properly. Though it would take Mickey a while to fully recover, and it wouldn't be a fun process in the slightest. The hunger, about as bad as it gets. But we've entered a forest, and he's already fed me a couple of critters. Barely a snack, but it's only a matter of time until he finds something bigger. He moves fast. Percy increased the flow of fused mana a little. He'd had to tune it down a notch since the massacre to avoid provoking Acton again. But he also knew the crow needed every drop it could get, given the circumstances. Hang in there, buddy. I swear I'll get you back if it's the last thing I do. Though Mickey shook his head. I don't care about that. Promise me something else. Percy felt a bitter lump in his throat, already knowing what the crow meant. Mickey's words only confirming his suspicions a moment later. Whatever happens to me, kill the little shit. Chapter 289, Twilight City. Finally, it's working, Percy exclaimed, flickering the enchantment between states. Technically, it wasn't the first time he'd managed to heat the slab up, nor even the first time he'd gotten it to switch on and off at will. But it was his first time getting everything to work as intended, allowing him to cycle between all four states without fail. The slab was a bit hot to the touch at the highest setting, though he'd prepared for that, coating his hand in a thin layer of pure mana before playing around with the runes. Congratulations, Percy. Does that mean you're ready to craft yourself a new cauldron? Elaine asked. Naturally, he'd already briefed his companions about his latest project, seeing no reason to hide it from them. He trusted both of them with his life. I'd love to, but I'm not quite there yet. He scratched his head before elaborating. I'll need to stick more than 2 control runes on each enchantment, or it's going to be worse than my current one. It would also be nice if I could get a little better at drawing them first. Otherwise, I'll have to carve each rune 100 times to get them all right. Regardless, a wide grin was plastered all over his face. Despite all the stress he was under, this was the first positive development in weeks. He'd at least grasped the underlying principles behind the cascading controls. Now, it was only a matter of pouring some more time and effort into it. Part of him wanted to get started on that right away, but his eyes couldn't help but veer off to the distance, as a colossal city faintly appeared on the horizon. The others followed his gaze, letting out startled gasps in the process. The city was still a few hours away, but it was clear it stretched for tens of miles across, its bright lights scattered like tiny dots, almost blending into the starry sky above it. Is this the place? Elaine threw him a questioning look, some excitement bleeding into her voice. It has to be. He nodded, prompting her to exhale in relief. And she wasn't alone in feeling that way. Honestly, they could all use some rest. This city was where they were planning to live over the next few months. Right behind it, hidden by the vast stretch of tall buildings, was the place they actually wanted to get to, the Thirsty Valley. Though they weren't ready to sneak in just yet. First, they had to complete their preparations. It's even larger than I thought it would be. The house that owns it must be filthy rich, Elaine concluded. Well, it is the most densely populated area on Remier. But you're wrong about the last part. It doesn't belong to any one family. It's somewhat neutral, Percy explained, causing her to raise an eyebrow. Neutral? Does the Divine Order even allow that? Who makes all the decisions here? This time it was Nesha who answered, however. Well, obviously, if the Order wants something, everyone has to oblige. Not that different from everything else on Remier. Really? But for the most part, they don't bother. They can't be asked to manage a city this large by themselves. It's too big even for the Divine Root. It's governed by its own organization, the Black and White Syndicate. As long as they don't do anything too egregious, the Order lets them do as they please. Black and White Syndicate? Sounds ominous. Elaine frowned. They did start off as a bunch of criminals. Percy shrugged. This is actually the one place on Remier where bandits and lowlifes are free to sell their loot with relative impunity. And the Order doesn't arrest them. Right next to the Thirsty Valley? They kinda benefit from it too. he said before elaborating. At first, there hadn't been anything next to the valley. This all changed when some daring people set up a few shops and inns. The Greenborns didn't mind that. In fact, they welcomed it, as they finally had a place to rest and restock their supplies before commencing their training. Even when a couple thieves tried to launder their ill-begotten money in the settlement, nobody cared. After all, the more this place grew, the more useful it was for the order. The genuine version of this novel can be found on another site. Support the author by reading it there. Eventually, more people joined. Commoners realized this was one of the few places on Remir they could call their own, without being driven away or ruled by the nobles. Small-time criminals realized the order would turn a blind eye to their checkered past, giving them a chance to build a new life for themselves and their families. Thus, the small collection of inns and restaurants turned into a tiny village, and then into a town no smaller than the ones they'd seen along the way. But the town kept growing, until it far surpassed any other on Remir. Everyone, from the most prestigious merchants to the most prolific crime lords, funneled huge amounts of resources from all over the world, accelerating the city's growth. And so, the Twilight City was born, a place where law and crime freely mix. Of course, that didn't mean people were allowed to rob or murder in broad daylight. The city wouldn't have survived for more than a week had that been the case. But as long as everyone behaved within the city's walls, nobody asked them any inconvenient questions. "Does that mean we're also in the clear?" Elaine asked, her eyes sparkling with hope. "If only it were that easy," Percy smiled bitterly. "Directly defying the divine order, as we have, is the one thing that won't be forgiven. We'll still have to be careful." Elaine nodded as Nesha spoke. "It's not all bad. There are actually a few things that work in our favor. The Twilight City scope goes beyond a mere supporting pillar for the valley now. It's one of the largest trading hubs on Remir, arguably larger than the Guild. The only downside is that we can't buy nectar here, as exporting it out of the fungal spire isn't allowed. Still, we shouldn't have much trouble finding everything else we need." "Wait, what's the point of trading alchemical reagents here? Aren't most of Remir's alchemists staying in the Guild?" Elaine asked. "For the most part, yes. And even the few who aren't can't do much without nectar. The market for potions is much smaller. But many reagents have other uses. As for the ingredients which are exclusive to alchemy, they are still often gathered here from all over Remir, to be transported to the Guild in larger batches. The Syndicate is one of the Guild's most prominent suppliers," Nesha explained. Listening to her, Percy cracked a wry smile. She wasn't wrong, but she'd omitted one tiny detail. Finding and buying the reagents they needed were two entirely separate matters. Even if they found a diatomite ingredient suitable for the Aurora Dew, procuring the sheer volume they needed without raising an eyebrow would be a challenge. But that was a problem for later. Meanwhile, his cousin couldn't help but toss another glance at the colossal city before her. "How long did it take for it to grow this big?" "Beats me. Probably thousands of years," he replied. "The Syndicate is the strongest organization on Remir under the Great Houses. The only one of its kind, too, considering that they don't let any nobles or Yellowborns join." "Seriously? How can it be this powerful without Yellowborns? Orangeborns can't get to Violet or White." Percy nodded. "Indeed. But the Syndicate has a lot of blues. And I mean a lot. They are called the 72 Veiled Ladies and 72 Radiant Lords. Most of them are over 1,000 years old. And each governs one of the city's 144 districts. Suffice to say, finding such a powerful force outside the noble families was highly atypical. Under normal circumstances, the nobles should have fought tooth and nail to recruit these people. Granted, most houses primarily invited Yellowborns, not Orangeborns, but that distinction only applied to the younger ones. After all, unless an Orangeborn peasant had mutated a powerful bloodline, they weren't worth the investment. It would take them over 500 years to reach blue. Not to mention the ridiculous amount of elixir they'd consume to get there. And only a small fraction would even survive that long, the rest ending up a waste of resources. But Orangeborns who had already reached blue were a different story. They might be stuck there for the rest of their lives, but they could still live over 4,000 years in total, which wasn't a short time by anybody's standards. And blues were immensely valuable strategic resources for any house, as a group of them could even topple a violet. I've heard that the lords and ladies in the syndicate do receive lots of invitations and marriage proposals. No surprise there, but they tend to refuse, Nesha said. Really? Elaine was surprised. Not to toot our own horn, but I thought commoners generally jumped at the opportunity to join a house. Not if their life is already more comfortable here, not to mention safer since they don't need to get involved in the wars. In fact, the exact opposite dynamic has been reported. Some Yellowborn Blues have tried to defect from their families and join the syndicate, only to be rejected. These people actively despise us nobles. Many of them suffered through traumatic experiences in their past. You think we'll get in trouble? Elaine asked. Percy chuckled. Elaine, if anyone figures out who we are, we'll have bigger issues than some noble-hating blues, though I'm afraid we'll need to take a risk at some point. Yeah, we will, Nesha agreed. The easiest way to get the ingredients we need is to approach one of the lords or ladies and offer them a good deal. Elaine swallowed hard, probably realizing once more how dangerous her decision to follow Percy was. But she didn't say anything, picking the pace up instead. As did the rest of them, eager to reach their destination a minute sooner. Not only was Mickey counting on them, but they could hardly wait to see the bustling city from up close. Chapter 290. 138th District. Not every settlement on Remier took the same approach to security. Some of the smallest, most decrepit places, like Bogside Town, didn't even have a fence, let alone guards or a wall. As for the richer towns, like the ones Percy's group had recently traveled through, they could at least afford the bare minimum. They were enclosed in simple walls, making it a little harder for wandering beasts and criminals to sneak in unnoticed. Then, there were the locations of strategic importance like the Alchemist's Guild, places so well defended that entering or exiting without permission was nearly impossible. Unless, of course, you were a flying beast, or had the means to dig through a magical hive teeming with monstrous wasps. Twilight City, however, was an outlier. It didn't fit neatly into any of those categories. On one hand, the entire city was surrounded by a massive wall, 20 meters tall and 3 meters thick, made of solid stone. It was exactly the kind of fortification one might rely on to repel an invading army. Yet, despite its imposing presence, Percy didn't see any guards near the bronze gate. Its colossal leaves stood wide open even in the dead of night, inviting anyone to freely enter, making him question why they'd even bothered building the wall in the first place. It's mostly to keep beasts out, and, well, they can close the gates and man the walls in the case of an emergency. But nothing of the sort has ever happened, as far as I know, Nesha said, answering the unspoken question in his eyes. As for people, everyone is allowed inside anyway, so what would even be the point of guards? With no one stopping them, the trio entered the city, immediately struck by its unique architecture. Every building, whether a house or a shop, was at least 3 stories tall and made entirely of stone. The site reminded Percy of the guild settlement, though there were a couple of key differences. For one, the city obviously lacked the colorful moats that bathed the base of the fungal spire. Nor were there any glowing runes carved into the exteriors of the buildings. Maybe the relative scarcity of ambient mana made it harder to power them efficiently. Or perhaps the city was simply too vast to get everything enchanted. As a result, many of the buildings looked a little worn. Without the self-repair enchantments, they likely had to be maintained, or even replaced, regularly. Another detail stood out, a more glaring one, in fact. Nearly everything around them was pitch black. The buildings, the stone paths beneath their feet, even the occasional bench by the side of the street. The older-looking structures were merely painted, but some of the newer ones looked like they had been constructed out of darker materials to begin with. If that wasn't enough, Percy noticed a couple of trees planted along the sidewalk a few dozen meters ahead. Even those had been selected to match the aesthetic, their ebony trunks and similarly colored leaves fitting right in. What's up with their fashion sense? Are they mourning somebody's death? Elaine grimaced, clearly not very enthused by all this. Percy also raised an eyebrow. From afar, the city's details had been somewhat hazy, especially at night. But now that he was closer, he had to admit, it did look a little gloomy. It's part of the theme, Nesha chuckled. You'll understand why when we reach the next district. Been here before? Percy asked. Everything he knew about Twilight City was secondhand information that had mostly come from books. Sadly, it didn't include details about the city's appearance or its daily life. Nesha, on the other hand, seemed to know a lot more about it for some reason. Unlawfully taken from Royal Road, this story should be reported if seen on Amazon. Once, she nodded. My dad sent me here as a child. Before everything. Her gaze drifted off for a moment, but she shook it off before he or Elaine could offer their sympathy. Oh, but it wasn't exactly a vacation. It's just a good place for an aspiring merchant to visit. You can't really expect to get good at trade without seeing one of Remir's grandest markets with your own eyes. Percy couldn't help but scratch his head in embarrassment. Mind leading the way, then? I admit, my plan gets more vague past this point. I figured as much. Nesha smirked. Then, she tapped her chin, thinking, let's see. It's been over a decade since my last visit, but I suppose the inns in the 115th district should still be among the best. Gesturing for them to follow, she led them through what she explained was the 138th district. Another huge difference from the guild was that this place seemed to have a thriving nightlife. Peddlers lined the streets, selling everything from clothes and snacks to drugs and weapons. Among them, they even met a few women of questionable occupation. Some of them were sitting on the ground, others leaning seductively on the walls, all of them eyeing potential customers. Most of them flashed Percy bright smiles or playful winks, subtly inviting him to seek them out later. Luckily, for everyone involved, they didn't do much more than that, likely deterred by Nesha and Elaine's presence by his side. Of course, Percy was way too tired to pay them much attention. His body ached from head to toe, each step a monumental and agonizing endeavor. Even keeping his eyelids from drooping took everything he had, let alone dragging his feet forward. If Nesha and Elaine's frequent yawns were any indication, his companions weren't doing much better. Still, one girl did briefly catch his eye, prompting him to sober up a little. She was a touch prettier than her colleagues, seemingly in her early 20s. Her hair was a wheat blonde color, the air around her thick with the overly sweet scent of berries. Her eyes glistened in a deep blue, like a pair of sapphires. Well, glistened in the non-magical sense, at least. She wore a tight dress that barely reached halfway through her thighs, leaving very little to the imagination. Percy's purely appreciative gaze might have lingered a second too long, however, as a pitch-black butterfly fluttered past his face, nearly landing on his nose. He might have missed it too, its dark frame blending seamlessly with the background, if not for its silhouette shining in a bright yellow before his mutated eyes. Startled, he nearly stumbled as he tried to avoid it, careful not to let the lethal construct touch him, lest he lost an eye or, worse, his life. By the time he turned to Nesha, his heart pounded like a drum, though his girlfriend strode forward nonchalantly, not even bothering to look at him. Swallowing hard, he awkwardly waved the girl goodbye before quickening his pace. As soon as he reached Elaine's side, he was rewarded with a jab from her elbow. Stifling a groan, he rubbed his bruised ribs, wondering if his purely academic curiosity even warranted such harsh treatment. Meanwhile, his cousin gave him a stern look, though he knew her well enough to tell she was holding back a chuckle. I guess my glowing eyes are popular with the ladies. Percy coughed dryly. Dream on, Nesha scoffed. They'd hit on a chimpanzee if they thought he could pay for it. Scratching his head, Percy followed her in silence. Luckily, the girls didn't say much either, sparing him from further condemnation. The trio walked for a few more minutes, their steps barely audible through the cacophony of voices around them. Apparently, the 138th district stretched for at least a handful of miles. Or actually, were they still in the same district? Or had they already crossed over to the next one? Percy had no way to tell. He opened his mouth, about to voice his question, not only to satisfy his curiosity, but also to hopefully distract Nesha from other, less convenient matters. Yet, he never got the chance, the answer revealing itself before him. A couple 100 meters ahead, the district finally came to an abrupt end. How did he know? Because the world itself changed. Currently, they were surrounded by obsidian buildings and black streets, only able to see past their noses thanks to the scarce city lights barely illuminating the dark contours around them. Yet, past a certain point, everything inverted, black to white, shadow to stark brilliance. The houses, the pavement, even the air itself almost seemed brighter, as though night crossed into day, as if that was something men could control, and not determined by the sky above their heads. Of course, that was merely an illusion, as the sun was still absent, and it was still the middle of the night. But the white surfaces of the next district did a better job reflecting the pale starlight, making it a far easier place to navigate. Welcome to the 126th district. Nesha grinned. Chapter 291. Chessboard. As soon as they entered the 126th district, Percy and Elaine couldn't help but gawk in awe at the drastic change in their surroundings. The black paint had been replaced by white, while materials like obsidian, basalt, and slate that made up the dark part of the city now gave way to alabaster and limestone. Hell, even the trees planted by the sidewalks were of a different variety, the ironwoods and ebonies replaced by aspens and birches. I know what you're thinking. The answer is yes. Each of the 144 districts is a perfect square of alternating colors. If you look at the city from above, it's like an oversized chessboard, Nesha said. I admit, it's impressive, but it sounds like a whole lot of effort just to make the place look prettier, Percy replied. But Nesha shook her head. Actually, it's like this for purely practical reasons. He and Elaine flashed her questioning looks, prompting her to elaborate. The city didn't always look this way, and neither the Radiant Lords nor the Veiled Ladies were called that in the early days. Nor was the Syndicate. The city was still separated into districts, but there were fewer of them, and they weren't as cleanly defined. But there was still a single manager presiding over each one, and you already know that many of these people come from shady backgrounds. So, you can probably guess what happened. They fought over territory? Percy asked, getting a nod back. Yeah, the Blues were all greedy people, and they constantly fought over the boundaries of their districts, scheming against one another for every last centimeter of land. Eventually, that started to create issues in the city's management. So the Divine Order forced them to sit at a table and figure out a solution. And this is the result. Percy couldn't help but let out an amused whistle. Quite an innovative solution, if a bit overkill. At least now, every manager knew exactly where their district ended and the next one began, leaving no room for interpretation or ploys. So, what do they do whenever the city needs to expand? Elaine asked. They add a new row or column of districts, and open just as many new positions for lords and ladies. They have to renumber the districts too, otherwise the numbering would get messy. But it doesn't happen that often. I believe the last expansion happened about 400 years ago. Before then, there were only 132 districts, in a 12 by 11 grid. And the managers just accept that? Doesn't their authority get diluted whenever they introduce new seats? Percy asked. It does, but it can't be helped. It's not like they can stop the city's growth, nor would they want to. The benefits they get from the expansion vastly outweigh what they lose by having to share. Percy chuckled. Funny how much trouble they went through, painting the whole place up, just because they couldn't control their own greed. Well, the current arrangement runs like clockwork, so who are we to judge? Nesha shrugged. Besides, the changes go beyond cosmetics. Haven't you noticed? Percy followed her glance, only now registering how empty this place was. Unlike the bustling 138th district they just passed through, there was hardly a soul roaming the streets, nor any lights coming out of the buildings. The area was quiet as a graveyard too, lacking the lively establishments of its neighbor. Not everyone likes to party all night. A lot of serious people live in Twilight City too. and they'd rather focus their energy on their daily ventures than waste their time drinking and gambling. Since the city was already split into black and white, the syndicate decided to impose quiet hours on the white districts to give their residents some peace and quiet. Nesha explained. A case of theft. This story is not rightfully on Amazon. If you spot it, report the violation. What if somebody wants to partake in both lifestyles? Elaine wondered. Nothing's stopping them. Everyone is free to go wherever they please, and the nearest district of the opposite color is always just a few minutes away. Thinking about something, Percy voiced a different question. I take it the Radiant Lords and Veiled Ladies also fit neatly into the theme? Nesha nodded. The Lords are always assigned to the black districts, and the ladies to the white ones. Hearing that, Elaine raised an eyebrow. Shouldn't it be the other way around? Actually, this works better. The whole idea is for them to dress in the opposite color so they stand out inside their territory. Of course, it doesn't mean they aren't allowed to do business elsewhere. Many of them run enterprises that span the whole city, but they need permission from their corresponding colleagues to operate in their districts. Percy nodded. He had a few more questions of his own, but he opted not to voice them. As much as he wanted to learn more about the city he'd be living in for the foreseeable future, he could do so later, when his brain wasn't fried. Elaine apparently felt the same way. The trio then sped up, knowing they didn't have long before daybreak. The 115th district where the inns were located was a white one, so they'd rather get themselves sorted before their neighbors woke up. As much as Percy's mutation and everyone's haircuts helped conceal their identities, they all understood how flimsy their disguises were, and they'd already spotted a couple of wanted posters of him and Nesha on the walls. Naturally, they had to take some additional precautions to minimize the risk of discovery. For instance, they'd already decided to employ fake names and to avoid wandering the city more than necessary. Not that they could avoid it entirely, but there was a huge difference between walking through the black districts at nighttime and traversing the white ones during the day. Another thing they discussed was the possibility of staying at different inns and operating independently of one another, for the most part. Their pursuers were on the lookout for both him and Nesha, so it was probably unwise to stick together as a group. Should we get hoods? Elaine suddenly asked. Unlike before, her voice was barely a whisper, as she didn't know if anyone could hear her, and this was a more sensitive topic. At first, I thought we'd stand out too much, but I saw plenty of people hiding their faces in the previous district, she added. Nesha shook her head, shooting the idea down. It might help in the short term, but it'll only draw more attention. There are people who make a living identifying criminals and selling their information, and the juiciest targets are those who actively try to hide, she explained, keeping her voice down too. I thought crime was typically ignored here? Elaine asked back. It is, but that's only the case inside the city. Depending on who you've pissed off, you could be hunted down the moment you step outside. Many people end up staying here forever. Seeing her pale, Nesha hurriedly spoke again to placate her. It's not all bad. At least the city is peaceful. Even the worst of the worst don't dare to stir up trouble, afraid of both the Order and the Syndicate. And it's not just fear either. From their perspective, this is their only sanctuary on Remir, so nobody wants to ruin that. It's unwise to shit where you sleep, and all that. The group had to cross 2 more districts to reach their destination, the transition from white to black and then back to white again no less jarring than before. Getting used to this would probably take a while. By the time they entered the 115th district, their exhaustion was palpable, their legs feeling like they were made of lead. Even worse, the sun was already out, some people out and about, opening up their shops for the day. Percy caught a whiff of freshly baked bread coming from around the corner, causing his mouth to water. It had been a while since he last had a proper meal, but he suppressed his hunger for the time being, knowing this wasn't a good time to indulge. They still had a few days of rations on them, so they were better off sending Elaine out to buy more supplies for them, after settling in. After all, she was the only one who wasn't wanted yet. Hopefully. Next, Nesha tried her best to recall the locations of a few medium-sized inns. Ideally, they didn't want them to be too popular or too expensive. Then again, they didn't want them to be too decrepit either, not only because they hoped to find some soundproofing runes in their bedrooms, but also because the establishments would have probably closed down since the last time she was here if they were too poorly managed. Then, she gave them directions to those inns, the trio parting ways before more people woke up. They all agreed to meet up again at a nearby park a couple days later, after getting some proper rest. They had plenty of work in front of them, having discussed the plan on the way here, and each of them had their own role to play. Chapter 292. Alchemical Experimentation. A few days had passed since Percy's group entered Twilight City, and everyone was beginning to adjust to their new life. Luckily, the 115th district hadn't changed that much since Nesha's previous visit, so the trio had found the inns right where she'd said they'd be. The accommodation was rather cheap too, the conditions more than livable. Percy's room wasn't exactly the largest, nor the most luxurious he'd seen on Remir, not by a long shot, but it was more than sufficient for his current needs, equipped with all the basics. Between the soundproofing runes, the comfy bed, the warm water and proper heating, he had everything he needed to make himself at home for the foreseeable future. From what the others had said, theirs were more or less the same. He wasn't sure what Nesha and Elaine had done upon first entering their own rooms, but he'd personally drank a couple healing potions to heal the torn skin on his soles, before taking a long, relaxing shower. Granted, he'd nearly fallen asleep more than once as he stood beneath the warm stream, the water splashing on his face doing very little to keep his eyelids from shutting. Still, he'd forced himself to persist, knowing he'd enjoy his rest a lot more if he wasn't covered in dried sweat. Sure enough, he'd managed to make it to his bed, passing out almost immediately upon sinking into the soft mattress. In the end, he'd slept for a full day, feeling quite invigorated by the time he'd had his fill. Since then, he'd only left the inn a handful of times, to meet up with the others. The rest of the time he'd spent locked up in his room, working on his side of the plan. I guess the tricolored clover is another bust, he sighed, emptying the inert sludge from his cauldron into a bucket by his side. He was currently sitting at a table in his room. Not quite a desk, but close enough. The pile of ingredients next to him was almost exhausted and, sadly, he didn't have much to show for it. If he failed to make any progress with the remaining reagents, he'd have to switch to a different task until his cousin brought him the next batch. Getting up, he washed his equipment in the bathroom, before returning to his seat for another attempt. Once again, he began the process by tossing 4 vials of elixir and just as many portions of teal powder into his cauldron. Naturally, the bonding step went by without any issues. It was only when he added the crushed petals of the illusionary rafflesia that he ran into trouble. Wasting vial after vial of his hard-earned elixirs left a bitter taste in his mouth. But he understood he couldn't make an omelette without breaking a few proverbial eggs. Besides, he was confident he'd succeed before he consumed even 1/100th of his stash, making this a somewhat acceptable expenditure. Gritting his teeth, he tuned the heat up to the second highest setting, knowing from his experience with the rainbow grass that the second round of deattunement required a much higher temperature. And thus, he began the brewing session anew. Man, deciphering the recipe is so much harder without Oren's help, he thought a few minutes later, wiping the sweat off his forehead as he stared at another failure. Percy wasn't the fledgling alchemist he'd once been. Both his mentor's many lessons and his own years of experience still vivid in his mind. Furthermore, the value of having successfully modified the recipe once already couldn't be overstated, as it pointed him in the right direction, allowing him to dodge several avoidable pitfalls. And that was without even mentioning how much his mutated eyes assisted him in his endeavor. This was an advantage that neither he nor Oren had possessed the first time around. Nor did any other alchemist on Remir for that matter. Suffice to say, he was confident his experiments would yield some positive results sooner rather than later. Still, it wasn't fast enough in his eyes. Not even close. He'd already lost several weeks of core purification since they downgraded to the regular elixirs. At least, they could still use the teal paste separately, allowing them to drink 2 doses per day instead of 1, but that was still slower than they'd like. Every day without Aurora Dew felt like a dagger through his heart. After all, it could easily translate to weeks if not months off the other end of his lifespan, bringing him that much further away from his ambitious goal of attaining divinity. The author's tale has been misappropriated. Report any instances of this story on Amazon. Okay, let's not be so dramatic. Rushing this is only going to make things worse. The Aurora Dew would save him several centuries in the long term. And that was without even considering any further improvements he might make. There wasn't much sense in crying over a few weeks. Taking a deep breath, Percy shifted his attention to something else. Come to think of it, all these deattunement ingredients looked a little similar. Most of them were rather exotic plants, their vibrant colors all over the place. Not that surprising they had this in common, really. Reagents used for a similar purpose tended to share the same affinity. Just like how pacification ingredients were always rich in ice mana. Then again, Percy didn't recall reading about the affinity that tied deattunement ingredients together. Perhaps it was a rare one that few alchemists had encountered in the past. Or maybe they just failed to make the connection. And even if any of them had, perhaps they just hadn't bothered to document this little detail for their successors. Still, based on everything he'd encountered in recent years, he couldn't help but notice it somewhat resembled Jason's karma mana. It's not just the color. I suppose the effect fits as well. Kinda. Deattunement essentially prevented an alchemic ingredient from reacting violently with the next mana type it encountered. Wasn't this mystical connection somewhat analogous to the ethereal strings his former opponent had manipulated during their fight? Or maybe Percy was just reaching, and this had nothing to do with that. He shrugged. Either way, it didn't really matter. Whatever the case, his current job was to complete the recipe as soon as possible, so they could all resume drinking Aurora Dew. Then again, that was only the first stage of their plan. Brewing a few doses per day to keep up with their consumption would be an improvement, but far from enough. What they really needed was to somehow convert their entire stash, so that they'd have over a decade's worth of Aurora Dew during their stay in the valley. A daunting task in and of itself. I guess I'll just have to trust Nesha with that. His girlfriend only roamed the city at night, as it was much safer for her that way. Her current job was to gather information from the Black Districts, leveraging both her bloodline and her skill set to do so. This was all to eventually establish the connections they needed to scale their operation up. After all, it would take a lot of money and a trustworthy partner to make the bulk purchases for them. Of course, that introduced another problem into the equation. Percy had no intention of revealing the Aurora Dew in this place. It was too valuable, too dangerous, enough so to potentially scare or entice even the most honest of partners into stabbing them in the back. Whatever deal they ended up striking, it would probably have the healing potions or the green mushrooms at its foundation. They might not be as lucrative as the Aurora Dew, but they were much safer to reveal. Not to mention easier to produce. As for the details of this hypothetical collaboration, he'd left everything up to Nesha, trusting her to weigh everything properly and minimize the risk. At least I have plenty of teal powder now, and I can easily make more. That's one less thing to worry about. The rest of her time, Nesha spent in her own room, working on her circulation pattern. Percy missed hanging out with her, and he'd like to think she felt the same way. But they both understood that staying together was a risk they could do without. Besides, it wasn't like they had the time to waste on distractions. Nor were they in the right mental space to enjoy themselves while Mickey was getting tortured by a psychopath. Speaking of which, how close are you guys to the city? He asked through the cord. Not sure where exactly the city is, but from what Acton said, we'll be there by the end of next week. Mickey replied a few seconds later. Percy frowned. This was even sooner than they'd expected. Granted, the boy traveled much faster than them, but between Percy's head start, Acton having to carry Mickey for much of the journey, and the detour the boy had taken to get him fed, Percy had thought they'd bought more time. Evidently not. At least Mickey was doing a lot better. His injuries hadn't healed completely, but he could at least fly by himself, albeit painfully. In fact, he'd pretended he couldn't for as long as possible, buying a few extra days in the process. His hunger wasn't entirely gone either, but Acton did get him enough food to keep him from starving. On top of that, Mickey had resumed using his own spells to conserve his stamina, improving his situation a little. And he'd even started working on his ice pattern again, though he hadn't made much progress with it quite yet. Alas, Percy had no idea whether Acton would even bother to stop by Twilight City, or whether he'd just head directly into the valley. In fact, he didn't even know which was preferable. If Acton stopped by the city, it would buy them a little more time, but he'd also reveal Mickey's existence to the rest of Remire. Obviously, nobody would bother his familiar much as long as he remained within the Holy Child's control. But this could introduce more complications down the line, once they managed to rescue him. Whatever the case, we need to make every second count. Chapter 293. Scaling. Percy was still struggling to fit the third control rune into the heating enchantment, and he needed to stack 4 of them to craft a cauldron on par with his own. Even worse, he wasn't satisfied with merely matching it. Ideally, he wanted to upgrade it. Otherwise, there wouldn't be much of a point. I guess it's gonna be tougher than I thought. Percy grimaced, staring at the fried enchantment on his training slab. Upon successfully stacking the second control rune, he'd assumed the rest of the journey would be smooth sailing. It appeared he might have been a little too optimistic, however. Wrapping his mind around the cascading controls was indeed half the battle, but the complexity of the enchantments still grew exponentially with each added rune. In other words, visualizing their joint effects was a lot harder each time, meaning that he had his work cut out for him. Nevertheless, Percy wasn't one to falter after the first setback. Or after the millionth, for that matter. Pouring mana into the self-repair runes, he erased the malfunctioning enchantment before going for another attempt. Upgrading his cauldron wasn't something he'd decided to do on a whim either. There was a very specific reason for it, one which tied heavily into their current plans. And once again, it had to do with the sheer quantity of elixirs that he needed to brew in a relatively short period of time. After all, Percy had stolen around 175,000 doses of elixir from House Tantalus. A downright colossal amount. Granted, he and his companions had consumed some during the past couple of months, but it had barely put a dent into his stash. And he needed to convert the entire thing into Aurora Dew pretty soon, preferably before they entered the valley. Well, I can try to do it inside if all else fails, but it's best to avoid that. Nearly all their spatial amulets were full to the brim with elixirs, leaving them no space to bring any more ingredients with them. Getting more amulets wasn't going to be easy either, as they were quite expensive, and Nesha wasn't ready to craft one. Yet, that wasn't even the main problem. Even if they found some way to smuggle the secondary ingredients into the valley, Percy wasn't sure if the conditions there were suitable for alchemy. The Thirsty Valley hadn't earned this name by accident. Accelerating time several-fold usually came hand in hand with severe side effects. From what he'd heard, all bodies of water were affected in strange ways after prolonged exposure to the temporal decree. For all he knew, that might extend to his brews. Thus, it would probably serve him well to have the Aurora Dew prepared beforehand and stored safely inside his amulets until the time he needed it, rather than to brew it out there in the open. Not to mention that he might not even have the luxury of sitting still for hours at a time, to brew peacefully. Thus, on top of completing the recipe and procuring a large volume of ingredients, Percy also had to vastly increase his own output. Currently, each brewing session starts with 4 doses of elixir and takes me about 15 minutes. He thought, doing the calculations in his head. Assuming he spent over 20 hours a day brewing, he could convert about 320 doses of elixirs into about half as much Aurora Dew. This was already several times more than what he used to brew back in the guild, during his collaboration with Nesha. Between his new eyes, and not having to waste 2/3 of his time condensing crystals, he could brew faster than ever before. Still, not fast enough. At this rate, he'd need nearly 2 years to convert the whole stash. Acton would be close to Violet by then, if not already there. Thus, Percy had to find a different solution. This tale has been pilfered from Royal Road. If found on Amazon, kindly file a report. Luckily, he already had one in mind. It was all thanks to an alchemic principle he'd read about on Atlantis. One that he hadn't been able to practice at the time, as it had some steep requirements. The scaling principle. Normally, Alchemists all over the universe tended to use cauldrons of a very specific size, capping the quantity of ingredients they could brew at once. Or, at least, this was the case with both the regular-shaped cauldrons they had on Remir and the airtight spherical cauldrons he'd seen on the underwater world. And there was a simple reason for that. As the quantity of ingredients went up, it became increasingly difficult for the enchantments to apply heat and pressure uniformly to the concoction. It was also harder for the alchemist to pry beneath the surface of the substance and to take all the internal changes into account. This resulted in one's yield declining sharply past a certain point. Trying to brew more than that was highly inefficient. On the other hand, brewing less than that was needlessly slow. Hence the standard size of cauldrons that multiple factions in the universe seem to have settled on, independently of one another. Yet, that only applied to novice alchemists on Atlantis. The more experienced ones had a few additional means at their disposal that other places lacked. One of them was, naturally, their eyes. Once they grew accustomed to their mutation, they could use it to peer deeper beneath the surface of the concoction, allowing them to handle the increased volume more easily. Percy hadn't felt confident to practice with this principle while sharing Enki's body, as neither of them had had much time to adjust to their new vision. Not to mention that he'd still been suffering from a rather intense headache as his two decrees fought for dominance inside his head. Even after returning to Remir, mastering the scaling principle just hadn't been a priority, as his plate had been full of other, more urgent matters. Finally, there was one more advantage the Atlanteans had, which had clearly helped them invent this principle. And funnily enough, this had probably been completely accidental. Their spherical cauldrons had initially only been designed as such purely out of necessity. It was the only way to brew anything underwater. Yet, they had inadvertently opened the door to a series of innovations that made their lives a lot easier. For one, they'd had to craft their cauldrons out of transparent materials, as that was the only way to even see what was going on inside with their regular vision. As luck would have it, this also helped alleviate some of the problems with scaling the concoctions up. The fact that their cauldrons fully encompassed the ingredients was also beneficial. It gave them twice the surface area, which not only allowed them to see more, but also to more uniformly apply their enchantments. Thus, master alchemists on Atlantis capitalized on all these advantages to use larger cauldrons than their untrained peers, allowing them to brew more ingredients at once. The exact size of their cauldrons depended on their skill. The more they improved, the further they could push their output without harming their yield. From what he'd read, some could even use cauldrons dozens of times larger than normal. That said, Percy was looking at something a little more modest to start with. I guess I'll start with a 5-fold increase. I can always craft a larger cauldron later, once I get better with the runes and the principle. Some losses would still be unavoidable, so it was best not to get too greedy. Other than that, Percy was confident he had everything he needed to craft himself an airtight cauldron just like the Atlanteans, and to dip his toes into the principle. He didn't have whatever materials they used, but that was fine. He had his own reinforced mana, and he could even turn it invisible at will. Granted, it would run some interference in his passive mana sense, but he could probably work around that by engraving controlled concealment runes on it. That way, he could tune their effect down until they only worked on the cauldron's walls, without hiding its contents from his eyes. Whoever the Atlanteans employed to craft their cauldrons for them was likely a more experienced runecrafter than Percy, but he figured the vault's superior runes would help close the gap. Lastly, his self-repair enchantments would allow him to maintain the cauldron in perfect condition. In fact, I have a much higher ceiling than them too. He grinned. Right now, even catching up to them might be a struggle, but Percy was confident that both his alchemical and his runecrafting skills would surpass theirs in due time. In fact, his eyes already had. So, believing in himself and in his plan, Percy continued to work on completing the recipe whenever he had enough ingredients at hand, and on improving his cauldron whenever he did not. Progress was slow, but steady. He estimated that getting everything in order would take a few weeks, though what happened just a couple days later still caught him by surprise. No, he hadn't succeeded yet in any of his projects. Not with the cauldron, and not with the Aurora Dew. Nesha hadn't brought him any news either, nor had Acton and Mickey reached the city. This new development had come from a more peculiar direction. From above, his clone was finally back. And what a haul this one had brought. Chapter 294. Taking Inventory. Percy was currently laying on his bed, his bedsheets soaked with sweat. Suffice to say, he wasn't doing so great. His heart raced like crazy, his brain throbbing painfully against his skull. I guess I should be happy about this. The more it hurts, the more useful stuff the clone has brought back. He sighed. Technically, his latest clone hadn't been gone for too long. Even if he included the extra week in the vault, some of his previous adventures had lasted longer. Still, he had worked non-stop during his stay on Felmara, and that was without considering how fruitful his time in the Wiseman's Chamber had been. Suffice to say, fully assimilating all these experiences would take a while. Incorporating everything into his arsenal and adjusting his plans accordingly wouldn't be a breeze either. First things first. This clone really made a mess, didn't he? Percy was used to reaping the benefits of his clone's adventures by now. This was why he even bothered sending them out in the first place. But having to clean after them was a relatively novel experience. Sure, this wasn't the only clone that had run into trouble. There was the one that had literally died on the way back, and the one that had ended up marked by Metatron. Still, neither of those clones had made things harder for his main body, really. After all, he could have simply chosen to never return to the vault if he'd wanted. Thus, this clone was completely different in that regard. Not only had he somehow managed to pick a fight with a god, but he'd also revealed the existence of circulation to Metatron. Both could bring long-lasting consequences to Percy. Moreover, the other times had been complete accidents out of his control. This time, his clone had actively chosen to do those things. If he'd wished, he could have simply abandoned the others in the auditorium, leaving Felmara quietly. Oh well, it could have been worse, he shrugged. As inconvenient as it was, Percy stood by his clone's actions. If he had to make the same choice again, he still wouldn't have left Tlaloc there to suffer, nor would he have allowed Leo to die. Besides, it wasn't so bad. Raziel had no idea how to find him, or even what he looked like. Percy had all the time in the world to build up his strength and return to Felmara on his own terms, when he was ready. As for Metatron, well, Percy had made the most of a tough situation there. At least, he'd managed to leverage the boosting art, getting the Titan to start treating his hosts better. That alone was enough to lift a huge weight off his chest. Not to mention how much easier the combat challenges would be from now on. And then, there was the best part about this trip. The thing that excited Percy the most. His gains. Most of his successful clones tended to only bring one or two valuable things back. Yet, this one had actually brought quite a few things with him. Since Percy wasn't in any condition to resume brewing or runecrafting, he figured he might as well go over everything in detail, and to see how it all fit into his plans. First was his new storage seal. Percy focused in his chest, in an area a couple inches below his sternum, where the recently retrieved chunk of his soul was already attaching itself to the rest. Inside it, he felt a foreign object floating harmlessly. It didn't interact with his flesh at all, existing exclusively within his soul. Let's see how much control I have over this thing. Drawing some soul mana from his core, he gave the seal a gentle push, feeling it moving through him. It was a little uncomfortable this time, unlike when he'd tried this in the vault. The main part of his soul was more rigid than the disembodied wisps he equipped his clones with, offering some resistance to the seal whenever it tried to move. Still, it only took him a few moments to push the seal to his hand, and a few more to get it to his foot or even inside his head. Clearly, Metatron hadn't lied about how easy it was to move. Percy now had complete freedom to choose whether he lent it to his clones, regardless of what part of his soul he fashioned them out of. The narrative has been stolen. If detected on Amazon, report the infringement. Nodding in satisfaction, he tried something else. Clamping the seal with his mana, he pulled at it from different directions, trying to split it in half. It resisted at first, forcing him to increase the pressure slightly. Still, the seal eventually obeyed, soon snapping into two smaller copies, each of them bouncing on opposite boundaries of his soul. Examining one of them, it didn't take him long to confirm that it worked exactly like the original. The only difference was that its internal storage was smaller. Now, the cubes are about 5 meters across. That's quite a loss, he frowned. This meant that each seal could only store about an eighth of the original, shrinking the overall volume to a quarter. Regardless, this was dozens of times more than all his spatial amulets combined. Just like that, Percy had solved his storage problem. He now had the means to bring as many ingredients into the Thirsty Valley as he wanted. Of course, he still wasn't planning to try brewing in there if he could avoid it, but he now had another option to fall back to, in case he failed to prepare adequately. Even better, the seal might help with another problem he'd been grappling with. Sadly, Mickey didn't have a spatial amulet on him right now. He'd traveled to Goldenfield Town with Elaine, and she'd been the one to carry all their stuff. Once Acton chased him off, he'd been left with nothing. That said, this wasn't necessarily a bad thing. Had Mickey possessed an amulet, the boy would have probably found and confiscated it by now, along with all the elixirs inside it. Besides, the crow didn't need the regular elixirs, since he could cleanse his second core using his own beast mana, at roughly the same rate. It was only when it came to Aurora Dew that he needed Percy's help, because he couldn't replicate the intricate cycle of destruction and regeneration by himself. Granted, they didn't have any Aurora Dew right now anyway, but Percy would have needed a way to deliver him some, once he brewed it. He didn't want his familiar's progress to stall for decades. Thanks to the seal, that's not a problem anymore. It was the perfect solution. Percy had all the tools he might need to bring it to fruition. He'd already practiced creating local clones on Remier, and he'd even verified how easily his clones could locate Mickey. After all, his familiar soul was the only one that didn't reject him, even when at full health. Well, besides his own, of course. This meant that he shouldn't have much trouble possessing Mickey and dropping a seal inside his soul before leaving. Acton would never know. Even better, Mickey might be able to pop the elixirs directly inside his stomach, given how easy it was to store and retrieve objects from the seal. That said, this wasn't without risk. Percy had never tried possessing his familiar before. There was a small chance of his clone getting stuck in Mickey's body, unable to escape. If that happened, he could permanently lose a second cord. It's still worth a shot. This wasn't guaranteed to happen. Even on the off chance that it did, it would serve as a valuable data point, informing him how his clones interacted with his familiars. It was something he'd have to investigate sooner or later, as he didn't know what other benefits he might be missing out on. Besides, even in the worst-case scenario, he would be advancing to yellow relatively soon. That should increase his capacity to sustain multiple cords, meaning that he wouldn't handicap himself entirely. Thinking of something else, Percy couldn't help but raise an eyebrow. Actually, possessing Mickey is probably a good idea regardless. Now that they could share each other's mana, fitting Mickey with a clone would help them master their new abilities faster. Practicing was currently a chore, as Percy had to get used to several things at once. Empowering their connection, accessing Mickey's cores from afar, and getting a feel for his ice affinity, all at the same time. Taking over the crow's body would vastly accelerate the process. He'd be able to play around with Mickey's mana directly, without having to go through the other steps. It was akin to breaking a more complicated task into smaller, bite-sized portions, so that he could digest them more easily. In fact, it was even better than that. Percy would effectively have two minds working on the same task. He could have both the clone and his main body collaborate with Mickey to attack the problem from various angles. At any rate, let's not get ahead of myself. Right now, mastering Mickey's affinities wasn't a priority. It was best to leave that for after they rescued him. Not only did they not have the time for it, he didn't want Mickey's personal strength to grow any more than necessary, as Acton might use it against them. For the time being, Percy only wanted his familiar to focus on his core's purification and on mastering circulation and regulation. Those were the things that would help with his hunger. The rest could wait. The same goes for precasting. Percy didn't have the time to adapt it to his own affinities, nor to integrate it into his spells. The technique was more useful for Mickey right now, but he'd rather not teach him while he was still on the opposite side. This wasn't the time to possess the crow either. He had to brew some Aurora Dew first, else there wouldn't be much of a point. Pulling some more mana from his core, Percy then pressed the two seals back together. They resisted at first, just like before, but they merged with a satisfying click, restoring the seal to its original size. All right then, that settles the seal and precasting. He grinned. It was time for the big stuff. Chapter 295. Planning ahead. Rubbing his hands, Percy summoned his status, eager to read all the recent changes. Undersir. Percival Avalon. Mana Cores. Mana Core 1, Orange Soul. Mana Core 2, Orange Pure Bloodline. Clone. Create a copy of yourself. Effect varies by affinity. Mutations. Sorcerer's Eye. Draws from the cumulative knowledge listed in the status to enhance one's vision, allowing them to discern details previously unseen. Spectral trait. Weaving. Boosts one's proclivity in manipulating one-dimensional structures. Spells. Concussive Blast. Crude. Secret Art. Soul Resonance. Refined. Spectral Art. Soul Stitching. Refined. Wild Art. Greater Foresight. Refined. Wild Art. Grim Dance. Refined. Spirit Forged Effigy. Refined. Soul Conversion. Refined. Soul Harvester. Refined. Reinforcement. Refined. Synchronization. Refined. Spectral Art. Phantom Scale Regalia. Masterful Alchemic Principles. Extraction. Separate and condense an ingredient's essence. Pacification. Delay an ingredient's activation rate. Redirection. Adjust an ingredient's effect. Deattunement. Prevent multiple conflicting ingredients from reacting with one another. Bonding. Enrich an ingredient with crystallized pure mana. Restructuring. Alter an ingredient's phase. Decrees. Phoebe's Decree grants access to your status. Iapetus Decree grants a bloodline. Morai's Decree grants a second mana core. Metatron's Decree open a one-way portal to the Vault of Magic at will. EA's Decree, modified, augments and enhances your status. Grants the Sorcerer's Eye. _____. It keeps getting longer, but I suppose that's a good thing. Shrugging, he shifted his gaze to the newest additions. Strictly speaking, there were only two of them, Concussive Blast and the Restructuring Principle. The former was merely a crude spell, the only one of its kind, staining his status once again, after all the trouble he'd gone through to upgrade everything. Worse still, this was a spell he couldn't even use without Mickey's help. Yet he wasn't too disappointed. More than anything, it was like an inert seed, representing his newfound understanding of precasting. Percy was confident he and Mickey would eventually turn it into something truly fearsome. Then there was the new principle, a rather complicated one which had taken him quite some time to master. Of all the things I brought back, restructuring might be the most useful in the short term. He smiled. Simply by having mastered another principle, Percy had grown as an alchemist. The benefit was indirect but still undeniably there. It would help him with everything he did, from completing the new recipe to improving his yield. In fact, it would probably help him master the scaling principle faster too. And with every new entry in his status, his eyes grew stronger, further boosting his proficiency. This might also solve our money problem. Initially, he had planned to brew healing potions for that. He'd only need some spoiled meat and some space to grow as many mushrooms as he wanted. Considering how large Twilight City was, it shouldn't be hard to get either. Unauthorized use of content. If you find this story on Amazon, report the violation. Once his cauldron was ready, he would then be able to practice the scaling principle on the potions. That way, he'd not only push his yield as high as possible before moving to the elixirs, but he'd also be able to sell the excess, to buy the secondary ingredients for the Aurora Dew. The only problem with this plan was that healing potions weren't that popular with highborns. Not to mention that the market was likely already saturated. Percy's only advantage was that he would probably be able to undercut his competition, given how easily he could grow the mushrooms. After all, he could do everything locally, without having to import any ingredients from outside the city, planting the mushrooms on what was essentially trash. Even so, there was no guarantee they would amass all the money they needed fast enough. But that was all in the past. The knowledge he'd brought from Felmara now opened a new door for him. Healing tattoos were arguably superior products, and not just due to their novelty. If he was right, injecting the potions directly into one's body would be more effective than consuming them. Not to mention how much easier it would be to activate a tattoo in the middle of a fight. That said, there were still a few challenges they'd have to overcome before they could mass-produce them. Brewing the ink would require an additional alchemic step, increasing the cost. They'd have to find a source of reagents rich in mud mana. Percy would have to spend more time and effort too, and with a lower yield to boot. Finally, they'd need to train somebody in applying the tattoos to their customers. I should discuss this with Nesha. She understands this stuff better than me. She'll know if this will sell better than the potions. In any case, Percy wasn't done going over his gains yet. Just thinking about his greatest prize from the trip made his mouth water. Against all odds, he'd managed to obtain the final step of the dance. Strictly speaking, it had been his goal from the start, but he could have never imagined things would go the way they had. Somehow, he'd ended up on the wrong planet, spending most of his time there oblivious to the fact that it was even connected to Huehue. Regardless, in the end he'd still learned the technique from one of Mickey's people, just like he had planned. It's such a pity I can't practice it right away. He smiled bitterly. Mastering the spell would massively boost his combat strength. Other than reaching yellow, this was easily the most direct way to bridge the gap between him and Acton, at least partially. In fact, if Elaine learned it too, they might be able to defeat him together, even without advancing. Sadly, that was just wishful thinking. From what little he'd seen, Percy knew the complete spell was quite intricate, probably a masterful one, and, unlike circulation, he hadn't experienced it directly. He'd only caught a fleeting glimpse of Tlaloc's demonstration. The good news was that he shared the guy's pure affinity, and he'd seen enough to feel confident in reproducing it. But it would take time. Months, maybe even years. Adapting it to other affinities and teaching his companions would take longer still. Right now, I have to focus on converting the elixirs and sneaking into the valley. I can practice the spell there. Percy had always planned to work on his spells during his stay in the Temporal Decree. After all, drinking Aurora Dew would only take a few minutes per day, and he had to spend over a decade in there. Since brewing wouldn't be an option, he'd considered working on his mana threads. Evidently, he now had one more thing to look forward to. If everything went well, the Percy who walked out from the valley a couple years from now would be a completely different person. Alas, there was no use in daydreaming about a future that might not even come to pass. Anything and everything could go wrong before then. He shrugged. All right, so that's the bulk of my loot. Though there are a couple more things to consider. Other than the storage seal, precasting, restructuring, and the dance, Percy had brought a few less tangible things back. There was the inspiration he'd drawn from the Wiseman's Chamber. In the future, he intended to look into inhalable potions or time acceleration enchantments. Even more importantly, he'd like to get his hands on some Wiseman's dust if possible. The miraculous substance had done wonders for his training, and he wouldn't say no to another round. If only I had the seal back then, maybe I could have stolen some. Then again, getting through the fortified panel would have been a challenge. In any case, there were also the books he'd brought from the vault, but he wasn't going to go through them just yet. And there was everything he'd learned about the universe in general, and the Greater Springs in particular, through his cosmic studies classes. Recalling the cold look Mrs. Liah had given him in the auditorium, he couldn't help but sigh. It was such a stark contrast to the gentle smile and kind eyes she usually wore. But she's the one in the wrong. All of them are. Not me or Leo. He reminded himself. Percy could almost forgive the Felmarans for conquering Huehue. As much as he hated them for hurting Mickey and his people, he understood that the universe was a cold and brutal place. Every faction had to look after themselves first and foremost, and to do what they could to survive. Everyone was in a constant struggle for resources. They had to stay ahead of their enemies no matter what, lest they risked getting annihilated. That said, Percy would never forgive Raziel for the way he'd treated his prisoners. for torturing them, humiliating them, stuffing them in coliseums and forcing them to fight for their lives, parading them around like exhibits, trophies of his victory over their ancestors. All of that was unnecessary. The mere memory made Percy's blood boil as he clenched his fists until they were drained of color. I hope you don't forget my promise to you, Raziel, because I won't. Chapter 296. Dusty Old Hut. The half-moon shone dimly over Twilight City, bathing the park in its soft radiance. It illuminated the faces of the two people sitting side by side on an old bench, discussing something quietly. At some point, one of them, a bearded man with glowing eyes, carefully handed the woman something. There wasn't anyone else nearby, but he still made a conscious effort to hide the object in his sleeve for as long as possible before passing it over. It was a small black cube, strung on a thin chain. Lots of tiny lights decorated its surface, glittering like stars. They formed faint patterns that wouldn't have meant much to the average person. Yet, if a member of House Etna had been here, or a high-ranking noble, they would have certainly recognized it as a spatial amulet. The woman, a young lady in her early 20s with short azure hair, received the object, handing the man another one like it. Naturally, she was Elaine and the guy was Percy. The amulets were both full of elixirs, but the one she'd given him also contained the diatomite ingredients she'd purchased earlier that day. Did you run into any issues? He asked. Not really. She shook her head. I found almost everything you requested, except for the dazzling fern. I've already spoken to Ebony about it. She said I should try looking in the 91st district. Percy nodded. Ebony was the name Nesha was using while they stayed here. Elaine was Azure, while Percy had borrowed the name of one of his hosts, calling himself Noland. Bring it with the next batch if you find it. I've put the list in the amulet. Elaine was the only one in the group who wasn't a fugitive, so they'd given her the task of traveling through the white districts during the day to look for the ingredients he needed. Percy told her what to look for depending on how the experiments went, while Nesha instructed her on the best places to look for them. The rest of her time, she spent working for a water manifestation company. This was a special industry they employed in Twilight City to provide the residents with drinking water. Normally, villages and towns were built near sources of water, like rivers or lakes. Unfortunately, Twilight City had nothing of the sort nearby, as it had been built next to the Thirsty Valley. For that reason, the syndicate relied on water users to manifest water out of their own mana to provide for their residents' needs. The pay wasn't that great, especially since she only worked there part-time, but she figured it was good training for her. Manifesting streams of water for hours at a time gave her the chance to work on both her stamina and mana control. It was somewhat useful, since there wasn't any other place in the city suitable for a green to practice. Naturally, she couldn't use circulation while on the job, but the company provided their employees with a few magic potions per day to help them replenish their reserves faster. The potions cost a fair amount too, and they weren't too effective on the higher grades either. Still, the city's management clearly felt it was a small price to pay for the service Elaine and her colleagues provided. You don't look too good, she suddenly said, her voice tinged with concern. Is the clone back? Yeah, he sighed. My head is killing me. I took the afternoon off. Hopefully, I'll be back to brewing tomorrow. Anything good? Lots of things, he grinned, before lowering his voice even more. Most importantly, we've got it. The rest of the dance. Her eyes widened, her face full of questions. But he spoke again. It's a little complicated. We'll have to practice in the valley. For now, just stick to the plan. All right, she said, getting up. Percy grabbed her wrist, however, stopping her in her tracks. Are you meeting with Ebony soon? Tomorrow, Elaine said. They'd agreed to use different meeting spots with each other. Percy never met his cousin where he met Nesha. The girls used a third location for their own meetings, and they all scheduled their meetings in advance, based on what they needed from each other. In case of an emergency, they'd have to visit each other at their inn, of course, but they preferred to leave that as a last resort. Hopefully, it would make it harder for any prying eyes to track the whole group down. Honestly, They knew this was a bit overkill, but they'd rather be safe than sorry. Tell her we're moving our next meeting forward by 2 days. I have a few new things to discuss with her. They're related to alchemy and our upcoming business. If you spot this narrative on Amazon, know that it has been stolen. Report the violation. He let go of her hand as soon as he got a nod back. Elaine then walked away, leaving him alone in the park. The night was still young, and he could use some fresh air, the cold breeze doing wonders for his headache. It wasn't until about an hour later that he decided to return, hoping to get some shut-eye before the sun was up. He was already feeling a little better, so resuming work tomorrow was looking more and more likely. That said, he didn't head directly towards the inn. Instead, he opted to take the long way around the park, to explore the area a bit more. Not for any practical reason. He just wanted to appreciate the greenery a little longer. The park wasn't that large, only about a mile across. Still, it was maintained well, the hedges carefully trimmed, the grass regularly manicured. He hadn't seen any trash littering the place either, the whole garden completely spotless. A few minutes later, he reached the other side of the park. Satisfied with his break, he was about to leave, when something caught his attention. There was a small hut in the middle of the garden, looking completely out of place. The wooden planks lining its walls were densely covered in preservation runes, yet the enchantments seemed to have done little to stop the material from rotting, a testament to how ancient the hut was. Even the runes themselves were old, as many of them had already faded, their glow dim. Beyond that, Percy was confident that the enchantments hadn't been there from the start. They had probably been added later, in a futile attempt to maintain the decrepit house. After all, it didn't look like anything special, even by a commoner's standards. Even the houses in Bogside Town were larger than that. The most likely scenario was that somebody had grown interested enough in this place to try preserving it, long after its original owner had moved out. He hadn't the slightest clue who had done this, but they had to be sanctioned by the syndicate. That would explain why they built an entire park around it, and even erected a fence around the hut, covering it in "Do Not Trespass" signs. It's the owner of the hut who was special, not the place itself, somebody said, guessing his thoughts. It was a female voice, piercing the deafening silence of the park like a gentle melody. Gentle or not, it still caused Percy's heart to skip a beat, however. He'd only stayed here this long because he thought he was alone. Generally, he avoided meeting anyone he didn't have to minimize the risk of somebody recognizing him. But he didn't let his shock show on his face, unwilling to make himself any more suspicious. Turning slowly, he soon located the person who'd just spoken. A young lady wearing simple clothes, a ragged outfit of worn linen. Not the kind of attire one would expect to see on such a pretty girl. Her black hair fluttered softly in the wind, her delicate features looking like they'd been carved out of the finest jade. She stood a few dozen meters away, seemingly admiring the enchanted hut too. Every time the wind blew towards him, he caught whiff of a strange scent coming from her. It was faintly sweet, reminding him of agarwood, though it wasn't exactly the kind of perfume somebody would wear by choice. It was more like an aroma that had clung to her by accident, perhaps from her house, or her workplace. More importantly, a green core thrummed in her chest, and he had some trouble identifying her affinity, having never seen mana channels shaped like hers. It had to be a rare one that he hadn't seen since he got his mutated eyes, ruling out life, soul, karma, and space. Her cheap clothes notwithstanding, a yellowborn with a rare affinity was very likely to be a noble. Even worse, her face looked a little familiar, though he couldn't quite recall where he'd seen her before. Was it from the guild? Maybe she used to work there? Or was she some traveling merchant who'd passed through the settlement at some point during his stay? Then again, Percy had never been the most social person. He was sure she wasn't one of the attendants who'd bought his nectar and sold him the elixirs, and he hadn't met that many people in the guild. But where else could they have met? One of the towns on the way to Twilight City, perhaps. Or had she visited the Avalon Mansion when he was younger? Either way, this was bad. Getting seen by a stranger was already an unnecessary risk. Coming face to face with somebody he knew was 100 times worse. If she recognized him too, he was screwed. Panicking, he scrambled to think of a good excuse to run away before she got a better look at him. Then again, leaving in a rush would only draw more attention. What he needed to do was to keep a low profile and try not to make an impression. Thus, he didn't even dare to open his mouth, afraid his voice might give away more clues. The woman seemed to have mistaken his prolonged silence for something else, however. Her pink lips parted into a bright smile, two faint dimples forming on her cheeks. I didn't think anybody else would be interested in this hut. Most people don't spare it a second glance. It's sad, really, seeing a place with such a rich history forgotten like that. Percy frowned. Nothing in her words suggested she might have recognized him. This was a great start. Forcing himself to calm down, he took advantage of the situation, sinking deeper into the topic at hand, to distract her. What history? I have trouble figuring out why the syndicate has put so much time and effort into preserving a dusty old hut. She chuckled. It's not just a dusty old hut. It's the birthplace of a very influential person. He's the reason this city even exists. Percy couldn't help but raise an eyebrow. One of the founders, you mean? The people who built their restaurants next to the valley. Nope. Everyone knows that story, but they only settled here because of the valley. Almost nobody knows why the valley itself was placed here, though. Her words confused him more. As far as he could tell, the Thirsty Valley was a decree, cast here by a titan. How many people on Remir even knew what a decree was? Suddenly, he felt more on guard against the woman, giving her another appraising look. If she truly knew something that esoteric, she might be involved with the divine root in some way. This was even worse than he'd initially feared. Oblivious to his thoughts, she continued, however, soon confirming some of his suspicions. The Thirsty Valley was created by the Titan Kronos, a previous leader of the Divine Order, and he chose this place for purely sentimental reasons. Percy wanted to get the hell out of here. Still, realizing something, he pushed his worries aside for a moment, failing to contain his curiosity. The hut, was it? The woman nodded. It's where Kronos was born. This dusty old hut. Chapter 297, Clarity. Percy stared at the hut in stunned silence for a few seconds, partly because he hadn't decided what to say to the woman just yet, and partly because he found her words interesting. So, this little hut, standing stubbornly against the eroding march of time, had been the home of a titan once. Maybe he shouldn't be so surprised about something this minor, though. After all, he'd come face to face with living gods and breathing titans before. He'd even bargained with them, or threatened them directly. Still, this was different. Metatron and Raziel were aliens. On top of that, he only had memories of their meetings, since he'd never actually met them himself. Instead, there was something more real about Remir's gods. They were humans like him, or had been once, at least. They'd walked on the same ground as him, breathed the same air. Their actions had influenced everything and everyone he'd ever met, their decisions changing the course of history forever. He'd read stories of them as a child, having grown up taking their existence for granted. And there was something real about this tiny house too. It stood here, before his actual eyes, its rotting surfaces illuminated by the pale moonlight. It was made of wood, just plain old wood, harvested from trees native to Remir. The craftsmanship wasn't anything special either. Whoever had built the hut, whether it was the Titan himself or one of his ancestors, they clearly hadn't been very good at this. The mismatched planks left plenty of gaps between them. The roof had probably leaked a ton of water whenever it rained. Still did, in fact. It's not that different from our house in Bogside Town, actually, he thought, the nostalgic memory bringing a faint smile to his face. It was easy to think of the gods as these lofty existences who could shatter mountains and dry up lakes as casually as breathing. But they'd all started as mortals, much like him. Granted, they'd all been greenborns, so they'd never been quite as weak, nor had they been treated the same. Still, I'm guessing Kronos was a commoner? He asked. The woman nodded. He was, but that used to mean something slightly different back when Kronos was mortal. It's quite interesting if you think about it. How languages evolve with our culture. The very words we speak subtly change meaning over time, as if our history is woven into their very fabric. What do you mean? Hearing his question, she tapped her lip, seemingly gathering her thoughts. Kronos' predecessor, Iapetus, had already disseminated bloodlines among our people. But the current system of noble houses hadn't been established yet. There were a couple of kingdoms around, but peasants made up an even greater fraction of the population than they do today. And they were treated even worse. They were nothing more than objects, meant to serve their kings and queens. Even the Greenborns weren't protected from their cruelty, as the divine order prioritized internal affairs back then, rather than trying to strengthen our world. All the early gods, including Iapetus, had come from the royals themselves. So, how did Kronos even become a god? He snuck around, stealing elixir whenever he could, trying to advance while staying hidden in the shadows. Eventually, he slaughtered all the royals who had mistreated him and his family, before reaching godhood. Then, he killed the other gods too, leaving only Iapetus alive. He was the only one he forgave, purely out of respect for the bloodlines he'd gifted humanity with. Next, he reformed the order, establishing the system of noble houses. He was also the one who came up with the rule to protect and support all the Greenborns. Realizing this was the key to our world's prosperity. This all happened before he became a titan himself, mind you. Percy frowned. Sneaking around and stealing elixir? That sounded a little familiar. The guy was a proper badass too, having slaughtered many older gods with ease, as soon as he advanced. But that didn't mean Percy liked him. The author's narrative has been misappropriated. Report any instances of the story on Amazon. Wanting to probe the woman further, he pushed back a little. Is the current system supposed to be an improvement? Most people still live in poverty, and now Remir is drowning in constant war. Perhaps, but the number of people who do get better lives has gone up by several orders of magnitude. From a couple dozen royals to hundreds of thousands of nobles. Besides, the order never did this to improve everyone's living standards. Their goal was to foster the growth of new bloodlines and the emergence of more gods. We need them to protect our world from outsiders. Percy didn't like it, but he had no retort. Cruel as it was, the current status quo had done its job. At least, Remir had survived this long, hadn't it? The only places he'd seen that were arguably better were Atlantis and Felmara. The former only remained peaceful due to Ea's decree. It made their alchemists valuable, allowing them to collaborate amicably with other races. As for the latter, well, their prosperity had been built on the suffering of others. Alas, Percy was too tired, and in too much pain to reform Remir tonight. Besides, he had a more pressing concern at the forefront of his mind. How do you know all this? He couldn't help but ask. What he actually wanted to know was whether the woman was a member of the Divine Root. It would explain how she was privy to all this ancient information. At the same time, it would also be the worst-case scenario for him. But he didn't want to be too direct about it. If she truly was his enemy, he'd rather not clue her in. And maybe he was wrong, and this was all just a big coincidence. What can I say? I'm a student of history. I enjoy learning about our world's past. She shrugged. Besides, none of this is a secret. Hearing her response, Percy relaxed a little. Maybe he'd misjudged her? The Divine Order might not be in the business of spreading high-level information about decrees and other races, but they weren't entirely cryptic about less important stuff. People already knew about the 3 titans who had led the order in the past. Hell, they'd built statues of them on every temple, so people had seen their faces too. Looking into ancient history wasn't forbidden. It was just that very few people ever bothered. Regardless, I should still be careful of what I say in front of her. Whether she was affiliated with the order or not, the fact remained that he'd seen her before, somewhere. No matter how hard he dug, he failed to place her, the elusive information always slipping off the edge of his mind. In any case, since he'd recognized her, she could also recognize him, so it was still in his best interest to cut the meeting short. It's getting a bit late. Thanks for the history lesson, but I'll be going, he said, casually waving her goodbye. Wait! she said just as he was about to turn around, stopping him in his tracks. Percy swallowed hard, afraid that he got busted. Though her next words weren't what he was expecting. "Don't you want to check the hut out from inside?" He raised an eyebrow. "Isn't that against the rules?" he asked, gesturing at the signs. The woman chuckled, her voice ringing like a bell's chime. "Do you see anyone else around? The fence is just plain wood. Even the runes are only to preserve the hut. Nobody will know. We'll just steal a peek and get out." Percy had to admit he was slightly tempted. He'd be lying if he said he wasn't curious to see where the Titan had lived as a mortal, the bed where he'd slept as a child. But he shook his head. "Thanks for the offer. I'm sure it would be fun, especially with such pretty company. Though I don't think I want to disrespect the place." It wasn't a lie exactly. He really felt grateful to the Order and the Titans over everything they'd done for Remir, despite his current conflict with them. However, his priority was to put some distance from the woman before she pieced everything together. Not to mention that his status as a fugitive made it a terrible idea to start breaking city rules. She laughed again. "I didn't know you were such a stickler for the rules. Maybe it's those glowing eyes of yours? They make you look like more of a troublemaker." Ignoring him, she strode forward, climbing over the fence. Evidently, she intended to go through with this with or without him. "Ah, but please don't tell anyone about me," she hurriedly yelled, right before entering the hut. "Name's Clarity, by the way." "I'm Noland," Percy shouted back, already grabbing the opportunity to walk away as fast as possible. His heart was still racing, the conversation playing over and over again in his mind as he tried to make sense of it. Had he given anything away? Had she seemed suspicious of anything he'd said? He didn't think he had. The woman, Clarity, was quite odd, but she'd seemed entirely focused on the hut. Maybe he'd just confused her with somebody else? Yeah, on second thought, I don't think she's with the Order. Probably some crazy woman, with a soft spot for history. Thinking of all the members of the Root or the Order he'd interacted with, he just couldn't picture any of them dressed in a bunch of cheap rags. Nor could he imagine any of them engaging in a casual conversation with a random Redborn. For all her quirks, the woman was definitely quite approachable. Well, whatever. We should change ins tomorrow, just in case. Chapter 298. Changing District. Percy felt much better come morning. Even though he didn't get as much sleep as he would have liked. His headache hadn't subsided completely just yet. He'd likely have to put everything he'd learned on Felmara into practice before he could knock the last kinks off. That said, he'd improved enough to resume working. Before diving back into alchemy, he did spend some time sending out a new clone though. Taking advantage of his bloodline was always among his highest priorities. He hadn't sent the new guy out empty-handed either, equipping him with one of his spatial seals. Not the original, only a quarter since he didn't want to risk losing the whole thing if something went wrong. The storage space was only about 2.5 meters across, but that would probably be enough to bring back anything important. Percy also confirmed that he could seamlessly transfer objects from one seal to another, as long as both seals resided within the same soul. This meant he could freely allocate whatever resources he wanted to his clones before deploying them, without having to take his stuff out of the internal storage. But there was one thing he hadn't tested yet. He didn't know what would happen if he tried to split the seal when it was already full. Would the smaller seals break due to being unable to contain the objects? Or would the shrinking space crush its contents? Nah. Metatron wouldn't have made such a rookie mistake. More likely, either the seal would refuse to split until it was emptied, or it would automatically eject the excess objects to make space. Either way, Percy planned to be careful with it, unwilling to damage the precious artifact out of carelessness. Regardless, he hadn't kept in touch with the clone. It didn't seem like the clone had traveled far, so Percy could have probably kept soul resonance active if he'd wanted. But he didn't have time for that, opting to focus on alchemy instead. The sky was already dark by the time he exhausted the recent batch of deattunement ingredients. He had yet to brew any Aurora Dew, but that was not to say that he hadn't made progress. In fact, he'd almost succeeded with one of the reagents, giving him a few ideas on what to try next, and on how he could further optimize the second deattunement. All in all, Percy felt confident he'd get the recipe down within the next couple of batches. Alas, something else took precedence. Leaving the inn, Percy did something he would have preferred to avoid. He walked to the neighboring 116th district, a black one, finding Nesha and Elaine sitting together at a bar. This was their private meeting spot, which he wasn't supposed to ever visit. Suffice to say, the girls flashed him questioning looks. After all, using separate meeting spots had been his idea in the first place. Gesturing at them to follow him, he told them about his meeting with Clarity, explaining the need to move to a different district. He still didn't think the woman had recognized him. Even if she hadn't given him any indication that she meant him any harm. Not that a brief meeting like that was enough to get a feel for one's character. But Percy had a few additional reasons not to suspect her. To start, she hadn't really needed to trick him. Without his armor or his companions, Percy would have been hard-pressed to hold his own against a green. Certainly not without raising a commotion and drawing unnecessary attention to himself. The fact that a full day had passed without anyone knocking on his door further corroborated that the woman hadn't snitched on him. Regardless, the trio still chose to err on the side of caution. Packing their stuff, they abandoned the 115th district, moving all the way to the 11th. It was another white one, located at the other end of the city. Walking there took them a couple hours, and they'd even made sure to split up this time, unlike before, to avoid being spotted together by half the city. Sadly, the inns there were significantly worse than the ones they'd left behind. They weren't any cheaper, but their rooms were much smaller. Even the enchantments were in poor condition. Percy didn't know about the others, but the heating runes in his bathroom barely worked, forcing him to take a shower in lukewarm water. Reading on this site, this novel is published elsewhere. Support the author by seeking out the original. If the steep decline in their living standards wasn't enough, the girls would now have to walk a lot farther every day to reach all the places they needed to get to, making the whole situation even more inconvenient. Oh well, better safe than sorry. Strictly speaking, the safest option would have been to abandon the city completely. But that was tantamount to leaving Mickey in the Holy Child's mercy. Something that none of them was willing to consider. Besides, even if they ignored the crow's safety, it wasn't like they had much of a choice. They all understood there was an invisible sword hanging over their heads, about to fall at any moment. Reaching the next grade a decade sooner was something they needed to do, regardless. In fact, not entering the Thirsty Valley was arguably riskier than staying in the city. At least, it's not all bad. Everything considered, there was one upside to living in the 11th district. It was located along the northernmost edge of the city, bordering the valley directly. It would make it easier for them to investigate the valley's perimeter from here, allowing them to better prepare to infiltrate it. They'd also be able to ask the residents of the nearby districts questions about the valley, without it coming off as too strange. After all, it was only reasonable to be curious about a place that was just around the corner. Beyond that, Percy also got a chance to talk to Nesha about his recent gains. Hearing about the restructuring principle, she exhaled in relief, explaining that this would make her job easier. They weren't going to abandon the healing potions entirely, but, according to her, they'd earn money faster by selling both products. They would be targeting two entirely different markets. The healing potions would be aimed at poor families with lowborn children, who wanted to have a few doses at home in case of an emergency. Percy's lower price point would only make them more enticing. As for the healing tattoos, they were a more premium product, aimed at richer folk, or those who got in trouble often. For them, money wasn't necessarily an object. They'd be more likely to splurge, to get their hands on all the advantages the tattoos provided them with. On top of that, Nesha suggested that he got some practice brewing magic potions if he had the time. There was a lot of demand for those, thanks to the city's water manifestation companies. Percy wasn't opposed to the idea, since learning to brew a simple potion like that was relatively trivial for him, compared to all his other ventures, at least. This way, they'd be selling 3 products at once, maximizing their revenue. Admittedly, the thought of selling Troll's Fury potions did cross his mind, though he quickly shot the idea down. Naturally, he'd brew some for his own use, but most people on Remir didn't fight with their bodies. A physical enhancement riddled with drawbacks wouldn't be very popular. Any leads on potential partners yet? He asked, leaning on a wall by Nesha's side. A couple. She nodded, lowering her voice. Most notably, the Radiant Lord of the 44th District seems like a good candidate. Why him? When it came to this sort of stuff, Percy trusted her way more than he trusted himself. Still, he was curious. Many reasons. She shrugged. He's involved in the city's food industry, so he shouldn't have much trouble getting us the spoilt meat you need for your mushrooms. He's involved in the alchemy market too. Not as much as others, but he should be able to get us some secondary ingredients. Even better, he's got a reputation for treating his partners fairly. Unlike the other managers, he hasn't stabbed anyone in the back, as far as I can tell. Good. Percy nodded, liking what he was hearing. How safe is it, though? Nesha grinned. That's the best part. This guy hates the Order with a passion. Apparently, his sister was a Greenborn. His parents tried to hide her from the gods, only to end up executed. Even if he somehow learned who we are, I bet he wouldn't snitch on us. And if that wasn't enough, I've heard rumors that he got injured by a mind mage a few centuries ago. Supposedly, he hasn't been able to deploy his domain since. Percy raised an eyebrow. A domain was a blue's sharpest weapon, not to mention the most debilitating one when used against the lower grades. Without it, the man would still be a tough opponent, but not necessarily an insurmountable one. Should he betray them, it might be possible for him and Elaine to take him out with a well-prepared trap. Once again, Nesha had outdone herself. There was always the chance that something would go wrong, of course, much like what had happened in the guild. Still, Percy knew he couldn't have done better than this. How long do you need to set everything up? He asked. Depends. When will you need the supplies? I can move as quickly as we want. Just keep in mind that the slower I move, the safer it'll be. The recipe will be complete in a couple of days. We'll resume drinking the you-know-what, but we can manage that much by ourselves. The handful of ingredients Elaine brought him were more than enough to cover their daily needs. It was only for the bulk purchases that they'd need help from the Radiant Lord. What about mass production? She asked again. I'll need another month. Give or take. Ideally, I'd like to plant the mushrooms sooner though. Getting them to grow on Baldy's clones had been near instant. Explosively so, in fact. But they had violet bodies swimming in life mana of the same grade. Percy had no idea how much slower it would be when he planted them on some mundane meat. All right, I'll make my move by the end of the week. Chapter 299, Alexander. Another failure. Nesha grimaced. Emptying the excess mana from her channels, she plopped back onto the floor, her chest heaving up and down. On top of spending her nights to establish the supply lines they needed for their plan, she made sure to carve a few hours per day for circulation. Yet, no matter how much effort she poured into it, the pattern for the space affinity remained a mystery. The mana channels she'd cleared as a child were all right. They began at her sternum, spreading to every corner of her body, much like everyone else's. It was the new pathways she'd opened recently that didn't seem to make any sense. Many of them still started at her sternum, but instead of extending outward to her skin, they led to dead ends inside her body. Others were the opposite, beginning at her skin but never reaching her core. Both types were completely useless. After all, how could mana possibly flow through a pathway that had only a beginning but no end? The mana would just fill the channel in an instant, then stagnate, trapped with nowhere to go. Naturally, Nesha had considered ignoring these channels entirely, but that came with its own share of problems. Less than half of the new pathways were properly integrated into the network. If she relied only on those, her version of circulation would end up far weaker than Percy's or Elaine's. Worse still, the dead-end channels weren't the only ones causing issues. Some of them had only one entry but multiple exits, or vice versa. This forced her to artificially weaken the flow, to balance the input with the output. And even when she ignored the dead ends, stray mana still spilled into them by accident, accumulating dangerously in her body. Controlling the raging flow with perfect precision was impossible. The best one could do was to try and guide it. I guess there has to be some trick I haven't discovered yet. She shrugged. In any case, the sun was nearly down, and she had bigger plans for the night. Popping into the shower, she took a few minutes to wash up, before taking a pinky-sized vial out of her spatial amulet. Uncorking it, she drank the liquid in a single gulp, already gathering mana. First to her stomach and then back to her sternum. Naturally, this was a vial of Aurora Dew. Percy had kept his word, having completed the new recipe a few days ago. He said he'd replaced the rainbow grass with an ingredient called shimmering sap. The measly amounts Elaine bought for him were enough for now, but it was Nesha's job to make sure they got a lot more of it. Leaving the inn, she headed off, hoping to reach the bar in time. The 44th district was over an hour away, but at least she'd already learned to cleanse her core while walking. There you are. I was starting to think you weren't coming today. Gina, the barwoman, greeted her with a grin as soon as she stepped inside. You're acting like I'm late. Nesha rolled her eyes. It's the same time I come here every night. Nesha, or Ebony as people here knew her, had only started frequenting this place over the past week. In fact, she'd made a point to never miss a single night, to give the appearance of a regular. After all, she didn't want anyone to think she'd only started coming here on the same day as her targets. It wasn't the fanciest bar in the district. Far from it. In fact, it was rather filthy. The floors were sticky, the air thick with the scent of cheap alcohol, and the clientele sparse. But that was exactly what made it perfect. The fewer people who saw her, the better. Not to mention that she genuinely preferred the quiet. If you encounter this tale on Amazon, note that it's taken without the author's consent. Report it. Grabbing a pint of ale from Gina, she sat at her usual seat by the corner, idly sipping her drink as her thoughts drifted off to her earlier attempts with circulation. The number of people who arrived after her could be counted on one hand. Yet, she ignored everyone, only perking up when a certain couple entered the bar. She expertly hid her gaze, of course, but every ounce of her attention was glued onto the newcomers. The woman, Martina, wore a midnight blue gown. It wasn't very cheap, nor very expensive. In fact, Nesha knew exactly how much it had cost, as she was the one who'd paid for it. After all, Martina was somebody she'd hired to negotiate on her behalf, so she had to look the part. Nesha certainly couldn't have her wearing those dingy clothes she'd found her in. Even so, Martina still looked like a beggar next to the man who accompanied her. He was middle-aged, dressed in an elegant white suit, his polished shoes gleaming under the dim lighting. Rings adorned his fingers, and his neatly trimmed gray beard gave him an air of refinement. A powerful blue core thrummed in his chest. The only hint of black in his attire was a pin he wore on his shirt. It depicted 4 tiles, 2 of them white, the other 2 black, like a miniature chessboard, the insignia of the syndicate. Yet, despite his composed demeanor, his gaze wandered now and then, snapping back into focus a few seconds later. An aftereffect of his injury, no doubt. This was Alexander, the radiant lord of the 44th district, and the man Nesha was hoping to work with. My lord," Gina stammered as she practically ran to greet him, nearly tripping in the process. Only when she reached him did she give him a polite, albeit somewhat clumsy, curtsy. "It's my great honor to serve you tonight. What may I get for you?" The poor girl nearly had a heart attack as she fumbled over her words. Nesha knew Gina wasn't used to treating customers this politely, but she didn't blame her for trying to please the old blue. The radiant lords and veiled ladies had absolute control over their districts. A single word from Alexander, and this place would never open again. None of this was Ebony's business, though. After offering Alexander a polite nod, much like the handful of other customers did, she returned to her drink, appearing utterly uninterested in them. Martina took a seat 2 tables away from Nesha. It was the closest she could manage without drawing suspicion. Alexander followed, sitting opposite her. They exchanged a few pleasantries while waiting for Gina to bring their drinks, only moving on to business once the bartender returned to her post. Martina retrieved 4 objects from her purse, 3 glass vials and a piece of paper. 2 of the vials contained a vibrant green liquid, though one was tainted with a light shade of brown. The third vial was cyan. As for the paper, somebody had sketched the simple outline of a leaf. That was Nesha's idea, a brand to better market their healing tattoos. Following the script, Martina detailed their proposal. The remote warehouse they needed to cultivate the mushrooms, the spoiled meat required for the process, the employees who would handle planting and harvesting, the ingredients necessary for the ink and magic potions, and the prices they intended to set for the 3 products. Most of the discussion revolved around logistics, but Martina occasionally sprinkled in questions designed to tease out Alexander's true intentions, allowing Nesha to assess his honesty through her bloodline. Of course, Martina didn't know about that last part. She simply followed the list of questions Nesha had given her. Unbeknownst to her, Nesha had employed a similar tactic when vetting her a few days earlier, ensuring she was both intelligent and trustworthy enough to serve as the face of their operation. The meeting stretched for hours, eventually prompting Nesha to order a second drink. To Martina's credit, she adhered to the script perfectly, asking everything Nesha had instructed her to, and emphasizing the key selling points that might entice Alexander into agreeing. Sure enough, by the end of the discussion, the man had relaxed significantly, laughing and joking as they finalized the details of the deal. Nesha struggled to suppress a grin of her own. She was more than satisfied with his responses. She wasn't a mind reader, of course, especially when relying on a third party to ask the questions. But she felt confident Alexander was as pleased with their collaboration as she was, even if he remained completely oblivious to who his actual partners were. At the very least, she didn't expect him to try anything underhanded. Not that he had any reason to. This wasn't some illicit product they were peddling. Just a bunch of simple potions, really. Leaving the bar about half an hour after the others, she made her way back to the 11th district, eager to break the good news to Percy tomorrow. Little did she know, Percy had some bad news of his own to share. Chapter 300, Flawed Decree. Percy listened to Nesha as she briefed him in on her progress. It was great that they'd managed to get the Radiant Lord on board without a hitch, though that wasn't enough to wipe the frown off his face. "What's wrong? You don't look very happy," Nesha asked, noticing something. "Mickey contacted me a couple hours ago. They've entered the valley." Her eyes widened. "Immediately? Without even stopping to rest?" He sighed. Mickey was starting to get hungry again, and the kid knows he'll refuse to eat people. So, I guess we forced his hand. At least, Mickey wouldn't have to worry about food as long as he stayed there, since the place was packed full of yellow and green beasts. Of course, the valley's ecosystem was entirely artificial. After all, beasts of such high grades had difficulty surviving in even the densest forests and luscious jungles, let alone a barren wasteland like the Thirsty Valley. However, the Order didn't want their greenborns to sit idly for decades at a time, guzzling down elixirs while never bothering to hone their magic. If they did that, they'd grow up into weak gods, wholly incapable of defending their world. And that was assuming that they even made it that far. Most likely, they'd never attain divinity in the first place. Thus, they tasked the root with gathering beasts from all across Remir and dumping them in the valley on a daily basis. They didn't really care about creating a balanced ecosystem. That wasn't even possible to begin with. Most of the beasts got eaten immediately, while plenty more still starved to death. But enough survived, serving as practice dummies for the holy children. Suffice to say, the expenditure was enormous, especially since the ecosystem was embedded in vastly accelerated time. This was one of the reasons why the Divine Root was always short on manpower, despite being the largest noble house on Remir by far. On top of that, they had to maintain all the supply chains that they needed to function, escort the younger holy children wherever they traveled, ensure that all their temples operated as intended, and the list went on. But Percy didn't really care about their problems. The only thing that mattered was how it all reflected back to him and his companions. "Have you heard any disconcerting rumors?" Nesha shrugged. "Nothing I haven't told you already." News of the strange crow with a second core were already circulating Remir, having reached Twilight City before the Holy Child himself. The bird's existence had sparked interest everywhere, but most people still treated it as an isolated case. A freak of nature. Still fascinating, of course, but not as much as if they'd found a human like that. After all, nobody had any idea Mickey's circumstances were man-made or potentially reproducible. Of course, the order would likely pressure the kid into breeding Mickey with other crows once he returned, just on the off chance that he could pass his condition down. For the time being, nobody had dared to investigate the matter further, unwilling to get involved in Acton's business. People had learned about the tragedy in Goldenfield Town too, though their reaction to that was more lukewarm, everyone collectively choosing to sweep the incident under the rug. It wasn't every day a Greenborn went on a massacre, but cases like that weren't unheard of either. As far as the rest of Remire was concerned, the residents of the decimated town had simply been unlucky to find themselves in those circumstances. All right, keep an ear out for any updates. The Root should have learned about the missing guards too. Unauthorized duplication. This narrative has been taken without consent. Report sightings. Unlike the other matters, this hadn't spread yet. After all, nobody but Acton had known about that, so the Root had only learned about it today, upon receiving the boy's report. This was the story most likely to affect Percy's group in the short term, though he wasn't too worried about that. Nobody knew he'd stolen so much elixir from House Tantalus, nor could they imagine he was bold enough to try sneaking into the valley. Consequently, he'd be surprised if they connected Mickey or the missing guards to him and Nesha. The odds of them guessing he was currently hiding in Twilight City were even lower. Still, it wouldn't hurt to be cautious. "What's our new timeline?" Nesha asked. While they knew time passed several times faster inside the valley, hence their reason for even coming here in the first place, they didn't know exactly how much faster that was. Not because it was a secret, but because the temporal acceleration wasn't fixed. It fluctuated every few years, creating a very unique dynamic. Time inside the valley was separated into fast and less fast seasons. The flow ranged from 40 to 20 times that of the rest of Remire. The Order tended to send the Holy Children there during the faster seasons, giving the Root a chance to replenish the dead beasts during the slower seasons. But the kids weren't really prohibited from going there during the off-season either, if they wanted. "Let me check," Percy replied, asking his familiar to send him back a few images of his surroundings. The crow got back to him promptly, though the sensory input was way too fast for Percy to process. "Whoa! Slow down, buddy. Remember, time is flowing much faster for you right now." Dizzy as he was from the excessive stimuli, Percy had to suppress a chuckle, imagining how funny his words must have sounded to his familiar, coming in slow motion. He should also make an effort to speak faster as long as Mickey was in the valley, so that they'd hopefully meet somewhere in the middle. In any case, the bird didn't take long to adjust course. The images still reached Percy faster than he was used to, but it was more manageable now. Mickey was munching on some yellow lion. Acton stood some distance away, tormenting a green variant of the same species with his earth spells, probably working on improving them. Most notably, the area was densely covered in floating globules of water, each about the size of a peach. They inhibited Mickey's vision, preventing him from seeing very far. "I don't know if he's warned you about this, but try not to touch the globules. Certainly don't drink them. If you're thirsty, make water out of your mana," Percy said, speaking as fast as he could manage. The Thirsty Valley was actually full of water, though it hadn't earned its name by accident. The temporal magic clung to the water more closely than everything else, effectively poisoning it. Coming into contact with it would cause one to age faster, without getting any benefits back. Drinking it was even worse. Of course, the effect was subtle. Touching a few globules or even drinking one might not be immediately noticeable. Still, people were supposed to spend decades in there, so the effects could easily accumulate if one wasn't careful. Consequently, people were advised to do everything they could to shield their bodies from the globules during their stay. As for drinking water, many of them tended to bring a water user with them, as water mana wasn't affected directly. The time magic only began to poison it after it turned into regular water, and the process wasn't instant. Alternatively, people could bring water with them, as long as it was stored in a spatial device, as that supposedly shielded it from the environment. This was what Percy had originally planned to do, at least until Mickey got the pedal and Elaine joined the group. Of course, this phenomenon wasn't exactly an accident. Percy suspected it was very much intentional, built into the decree by Kronos to make it more efficient, allowing it to cover a wider area and to exhibit a greater temporal acceleration. After all, living beings consisted mostly of water, so this was a way to target the people training inside the valley more so than the inert rocks and dirt in the environment. As for all the unfortunate side effects, they were just a necessary inconvenience. Such a flawed decree. It was a strange thought, but a true one regardless. No decree was perfect, some having more drawbacks than others. Percy considered himself a bit of a connoisseur of divine magic, having run into a few decrees by now. Phoebe's and EA's were perfect examples of how two decrees with similar effects could be so different from one another. Metatron's was quite niche too, only useful for a very specific purpose. It was a stark reminder that Titans, however powerful, were ultimately just people. And decrees were just spells. Insanely complicated and incomparably vast. Yes, but spells nonetheless, subject to their caster's abilities and talents all the same. Alas, this wasn't the time to ponder the shortcomings of divine magic. Percy had already pieced together the information they needed. He turned back to Nesha before speaking. "I've got good news and bad news.